The bank manager's voice was doing that careful thing voices do when a person has been coached on exactly what not to say, and he was failing at it in real time, which is how I knew, before he ever finished his sentence, that my own son had already been in that building talking about me like I was a piece of furniture that needed to be moved out of a room. "Mr. Brannigan," he said, "I want to be transparent with you. We did receive a request last Thursday regarding the classification of your accounts, and I want you to know the bank takes these situations extremely seriously." I was sitting in my truck in the parking lot of First Travis Trust on Front Street with the engine still running and the heat blowing on my hands because it was late October and the wind off the bay had teeth in it that morning, and I said, "Gerald, say the sentence. Whatever sentence you're walking around the outside of, say it to me straight. I've had worse news than whatever's in your mouth right now." And Gerald Ackers, a man I had known since he was a teller with a bad haircut 22 years ago, a man whose daughter I built a hope chest for as a wedding present, took a breath I could hear over the phone and said it. "Your son came in and told us you were not competent to manage your own accounts, Mr. Brannigan. He requested emergency guardianship access to your savings, citing your medical condition and cognitive decline. He had a letter from a physician. I sat there with the heat blowing on my hands, 67 years old, 4 weeks out from a hospital stay that had scared me more than I let anybody see, and I felt something in my chest that was not the same thing the doctors had been watching for, something older and colder than a blocked artery, and I said, 'Gerald, thank you for calling me instead of just processing it.' And Gerald said, 'Walt, I've known you a long time. That's not why I called. I called because your file has a flag on it that I have never seen on an account in 19 years at this branch, and it came through before your son ever walked in the door, and I'm required to tell you that whatever he's trying to do, it already failed on our end before it started, because of something in your trust documentation. I don't fully understand it myself, but you're going to want to sit down with your attorney today, not this week. Today." I looked through my windshield at the grey water of West Bay past the marina, at the gulls fighting over something on the breakwall, and I said, "Gerald, I built a life out of understanding exactly how much weight a structure can take before it fails. My son just found out I built more of it than he ever bothered to ask about. Thank you for the call." And I hung up, and I sat there another minute with my hands on the wheel, and then I did the only thing that made sense to a man who spends his life around wood and grain and load. I laughed. Once. Short and hard because I already knew what document that flag was. I'd signed it myself 2 years ago in a quiet office 3 blocks from where I was parked, and my son didn't know it existed, and he was about to learn that some fathers build one thing you can see and one thing you can't, and they build the second one exactly for a day like this one. Welcome back to Dad's Cold Justice, friends, and if you're new here, get comfortable, because this channel isn't about shouting, it's about the kind of patience that takes months to pay off, and lands harder than anything you could have said in the moment it happened. I'm 67 years old. I built furniture and cabinetry for 40 years with these 2 hands, and I have learned that the loudest people in a family are almost never the ones actually holding the structure up. If you've ever been treated like you were already halfway gone by somebody who still calls you Dad, you're in the right chair. Grab your coffee, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if quiet justice is a flavour you like, subscribe, because there's a new one of these every single day, and I promise you, the freezer's always stocked. Now let me tell you how my only son walked into my own bank and told a room full of strangers that his father's mind was gone 4 weeks after I nearly died, and how a document I signed 2 years before any of it, in a plain manila folder in my lawyer's office, turned his entire plan into a signed confession before he ever got the chance to spend $1 of my money. My name is Walter Brannigan. Everybody who's known me more than a week calls me Walt. I'm 67 years old, and I have lived my whole life within about 11 miles of the same stretch of water, Grand Traverse Bay, on the old Mission Peninsula outside Traverse City, Michigan, in a farmhouse my wife Nora and I bought in 1988, and that I have been quietly rebuilding, board by board, for 37 years. I want to tell you what I did for a living, because it matters to everything that comes after. The same way it always matters what a man spent his life learning to notice. I ran a shop called Brannigan and Sons Custom Woodworks, out on Centre Road, in a pole barn I put up myself the summer Preston turned 9. Cabinetry, mostly. Built-ins for the big cherry orchard houses along the peninsula, staircases, the occasional chapel altar. Once a set of pews for a church in Elk Rapids that I still drive past sometimes just to look at through the window. 41 years of dovetail joints and mortise and tenon. 41 years of running my hand along a piece of walnut before I cut it, feeling for the place where the grain wants to go instead of where I want it to go, because wood, like people, tells you exactly what it's capable of if you're patient enough to listen before you start cutting. You learn something doing that kind of work for 4 decades. You learn that the failures you can see, the split board, the visible crack, those are rarely the ones that bring a piece down years later. It's the hidden stress, the joint that looks fine from the outside and is quietly working itself loose in the dark where nobody's checking. I built my whole business on finding those hidden stresses before they became a customer's problem. I did not, for the first 65 years of my life, think to apply that same careful eye to my own family. That was my mistake, and I'm going to walk you through exactly how I paid for it, and exactly how I made sure I never paid for it twice. Nora Brannigan, my wife, was the reason any of this house or this family existed at all, and I'm not going to rush past her, because everything I did later, every cold and careful thing, I did with her voice still living somewhere behind my sternum, telling me to slow down and check my angles before I made the cut. We met in the autumn of 1979 at a county fair outside Sutton's Bay, where she was working a lemonade stand for her church youth group, and I was 21 years old with sawdust permanently ground into the creases of my knuckles, and I bought 4 lemonades in 40 minutes just to keep talking to her, and by the 4th one she looked at me and said, "You don't even like lemonade, do you?" And I said, "Mom, I have never liked lemonade less in my entire life." And she laughed so hard she had to sit down on the cooler, and that was that. 42 years married, this past spring would have been 42 years, and I lost her 4 years ago now, a brain aneurysm that took her in an ambulance on a Tuesday afternoon in April, and took her out of this world completely 11 hours later. No warning, no long goodbye, no chance to say the last things a man wants to say to his wife of 4 decades. One minute she was standing in the kitchen telling me the hinges on the pantry door were squeaking again, and less than 12 hours later I was standing in a hospital corridor in Traverse City, being told there was nothing more anybody could do. I'm not going to spend long on that part of the story, because if you've buried someone you loved that suddenly, you already know every word I could put to it, and if you haven't, I don't have the words that would get you there anyway. I'll tell you only the one thing that matters for later. In the weeks after she died, in that particular fog where a man either falls apart completely or starts putting his affairs in order because paperwork is the only thing in the world that isn't asking him how he's holding up, I did the second thing, and the choice I made in that fog, the quiet, boring, unglamorous choice, is the entire reason this story ends the way it does instead of the way my son intended it to. Preston is my only child, 39 years old when all this happened, a financial advisor at a firm called Lakeshore Wealth Partners, a glass-fronted office on Front Street with a view of the bay that costs more per square foot than my whole shop. I want to be fair to him here at the start because it would be easy, and it would be a lie to tell you he was born the man who did what he did. He wasn't. He grew up in that pole barn with me on Saturday mornings, sanding scraps into little boats before he was old enough to hold real tools, and there's a workbench in that barn today with his initials burned into the underside of it, with a soldering iron when he was 11, PB, right next to mine, and I have run my thumb over those letters more times in the last year than I care to admit, trying to find the exact seam where the boy who burned his initials into my bench turned into the man who did what he did to me. Preston married Vanessa when he was 28. She's 36 now, and I'll be careful here, the same way I promised myself I'd be careful about Preston, because it takes 2 people to build what they built, and it would be too easy to make her the villain and my son the follower, and it wouldn't be honest. But I'll tell you what I noticed the very first Thanksgiving Preston brought her to Nora's table, back when Nora was alive, and the whole house smelled like sage, and the turkey Nora basted every 20 minutes like it was a job interview. Vanessa walked through my front door, and before she took off her coat, before she said a proper hello to my wife, her eyes went around that farmhouse like she was pricing an estate sale. The reclaimed beams I'd pulled out of a barn in Kalkaska, the built-in hutch I'd made from a single black walnut tree that came down in a storm on our own property, the long view down the orchard to the water. I watched her add it up in about 90 seconds, and when she finally looked at me, she smiled the exact smile of somebody who has just checked their math twice and likes the answer. Some people walk into a home and see a life. Some people see a number wearing a roof. I noticed which one I was looking at. I filed it away, the way you file away a hairline crack in a beam that isn't causing trouble yet, and I told myself it wasn't my business, because my son looked happy, and because that is the mistake every parent in a story like mine eventually makes. For a few years after Nora passed, things stayed quiet on the surface. Preston and Vanessa lived in a townhouse in downtown Traverse City, with a mortgage his firm helped him structure, the kind of arrangement where the numbers only work if the bonus checks keep arriving on schedule. They came out to the farmhouse maybe once a month, a Sunday drive up the peninsula, cherry stands closed for the season, gravel crunching in my driveway. Preston would walk the orchard rows with me for 20 minutes out of politeness, and then find a reason to check his phone the rest of the visit. Vanessa opened a wellness studio in 2022, some blend of infrared sauna pods and a juice bar and classes she called somatic release. And I want to be plain that I do not know enough about somatic release to have an opinion on it as a practice, only as a business, and as a business it bled money from the day the doors opened, because Traverse City has maybe 4,000 people willing to pay $90 for a sauna pod session in any given month, and Vanessa's studio needed about 400 of them showing up every week just to cover the lease on that space downtown. I learned the real numbers later, in documents that came out during everything that followed, but I could have guessed the shape of it just from watching her face get a little tighter every visit, a little more like a woman doing math in her head at a dinner table where nobody had asked her to. The first real crack, the one I can point to on a calendar, came in February of last year. Preston called me on a Wednesday night, and that alone told me something, because my son called on Sunday afternoons, when the drive home was fresh in his mind, and a little guilt about not visiting more was cheap and easy to spend. A Wednesday call meant he wanted something. He talked about the Red Wings for a while, he asked how my knee was holding up after the shop work, and then, with a little laugh that arrived just slightly ahead of the joke, the way it always did when he was working up to something, he said, "Hey Dad," random thought, "have you and Diane ever talked about, contingencies, for the accounts and the property, long term? You're out there alone on 11 acres, man. Vanessa worries about you. We both do." There it is, friends. It never arrives as "give me the money." It arrives as "we worry about you." Concern is the crowbar they use, and they slide it in soft and they lean on it a little harder every season, testing for give. I told him the truth, or most of the truth. I said, "Son, everything is handled. There's a plan, you're in it. And when the time comes, you won't have any reason to be embarrassed by any of it." And Preston laughed and said, No, I wasn't asking like that. And friends, he was asking exactly like that. And here is the part I never told him. The part nobody knew. Not my son, not Vanessa, not my poker buddies, not a soul on this earth except a lawyer named Diane Kowalski, and a locked filing cabinet in her office, 3 blocks from that bank. In the months after Nora died, in that fog I told you about, I had made a decision about my finances and my property that was about as far from dramatic as a decision gets. A boring, careful, structural decision, the kind an engineer or a cabinet maker makes without any drama at all, because we've both spent our lives learning that drama is what happens after you skip the boring step. That decision is the iceberg this whole story is steaming toward, and I'm going to tell you exactly what it was a little further along, because first you need to watch the cracks the way I watch them. One phone call, one dinner, one small comment at a time, because the pattern is the entire point of everything that follows. People show you who they are in inches, long before they ever show you in miles, and I had a whole ledger of inches by the time this story really started. By that summer, the inches were arriving faster. In June, Preston lost his largest client at the firm, a cherry orchard family who moved their whole portfolio to an advisor in Grand Rapids, after a disagreement I never got the full details of, and I know now, from records that surfaced much later, that this cost him nearly 40% of his annual commission in one afternoon. I know now that Vanessa's studio was carrying almost $72,000 in business debt across 2 lines of credit and a merchant cash advance she'd taken out against future card swipes. The kind of loan that eats a small business alive in exactly the way a rented boat eats a man who doesn't know the water. I know now that the townhouse had been refinanced once already to cover a shortfall, and that Preston had quietly borrowed $11,000 against his own 401k, a fact his firm would have frowned on if they'd known, since advising other people how to manage retirement money while raiding your own is the kind of detail that ends careers in that industry. $72,000 in studio debt, $11,000 pulled against retirement, a commission that had just dropped by nearly half. You don't need to be an engineer to run that load calculation. Something in that household was going to give, and when people feel the floor flexing beneath them, they very rarely look down at the choices that put them there. They look around the room for something solid that belongs to somebody else. That 4th of July, Preston and Vanessa came out to the farmhouse, and Vanessa brought her mother, Carol Denning, a retired real estate agent from Sutton's Bay who still kept her licence active and still talked like every conversation was a walkthrough. I was down at the barn checking on a batch of finish I'd put on a set of chairs, and the two of them were sitting on my back porch, and the window was cracked for the breeze, and sound carries strange around a farmhouse porch, bouncing off the barn wall in a way most people don't expect. Carol said, "Honey, I priced out 3 properties on this peninsula last month, and land like this, cleared and orchard producing with water frontage rights even if the house isn't on the water itself, that's not retirement money anymore, that's generational money, if it's handled right." And Vanessa said, "And he's got what, another 15 years in him? 20 if he keeps babying that knee?" And Carol laughed. The particular laugh of a woman who has said something cruel and doesn't intend to notice, and said, "You'd better hope it's not 20, sweetheart. Interest rates won't sit still for you that long." I stood very still in my own barn doorway with a rag full of tung oil in my hand, and I listened to my daughter-in-law and her mother price out the years I had left the way. You'd price a used truck. And I did not walk out onto that porch and say one word about it. I finished the chairs. I lit the grill. I handed out sparklers to the neighbour kids at dusk like nothing in the world had happened. Because a crack you know about and haven't spent yet is information, and information you spend for free in the heat of an argument is information you can never use again. Nora used to tell me I went too quiet when I was truly angry. She only ever saw the quiet. Preston and Vanessa were about to learn what lived underneath it. Even after the porch, friends, I want to be honest, I still believed we were years away from anything ugly. I thought the worst that might happen was an awkward conversation at a holiday, maybe a pamphlet for some retirement community left conspicuously on my counter like a hint I was supposed to take. What actually happened started on a Thursday morning in September, in the parking lot of the Olsons' grocery on Munson Avenue, when a pressure came into the left side of my head like somebody had set a cinder block on it, and the world tilted about 15 degrees to the right without my legs agreeing to follow, and I went down onto the asphalt between my truck and a shopping cart corral, hard enough to split my eyebrow open on the corral rail. A young woman named Beth, stocking the flower cooler outside, ran over and knelt beside me saying, "Sir, can you hear me, sir? Stay with me." And I remember the strangest detail that her apron had a cartoon cherry on it, because Traverse City puts a cherry on everything, and I remember thinking, even with half my face numb and my words coming out wrong, that it was a genuinely ugly logo for a grocery store apron. The ambulance ride, the fluorescent lights sliding past, a paramedic cutting my shirt open with the same kind of orange-handled scissors they must issue by the crate, and in the back of that rig, with the left side of my body refusing to answer when I asked it to move, I had exactly 2 thoughts, in this order. 1, so this is how it starts. 2, somebody needs to call Preston. Lord help me, even flat on my back with my own words coming out sideways, I still wanted my boy there. I was given that mercy at least before the sedation took me somewhere quiet. I did not hear what my son said when the hospital finally reached him. I know now. It's in the call logs. We'll get there. Transient ischemic attack, the neurologist called it, standing at the foot of my bed the next morning with a tablet in her hand and the calm weathered tone of a woman who has delivered this particular sentence more times than she can count. A mini-stroke, in plain language, a blockage that cleared on its own before it could do permanent damage, but a screaming warning shot from a body that had apparently been quietly narrowing an artery in my neck for years without asking my permission. They kept me 6 days at Munson Medical Centre for observation, imaging and what they called an abundance of caution, given my age and the family history I disclosed on intake, which included my own father's decline into vascular dementia in his final years, a fact I want you to hold on to because it becomes important later, in ways my son would try to use against me, and that I had already, quietly, protected myself from 2 years before he ever thought to try. 6 days. Keep that number in your pocket, friends, because 6 days is exactly how long it takes a son who has already done his homework to walk into his father's bank and start a process if the son is patient and the paperwork is already half prepared. Here's what I remember about that hospital room, aside from the water stain on the ceiling tile that looked, if you squinted, exactly like the state of Michigan's Lower Peninsula turned sideways, which struck me as almost too on the nose for a Michigan hospital. I remember the night nurse, a woman named Yolanda Reyes, who had a daughter studying nursing herself down at Central Michigan, and who talked to me low and steady while she checked my lines and my blood pressure cuff, the way you'd talk to a spooked animal that might still kick if it got scared enough, and I will be quietly grateful to that woman for the rest of whatever years I've got left. And I remember my phone sitting in a plastic bag in the drawer of the bedside table, and when I finally had enough strength back in my right hand to work it one-handed, I called my son. It was a Sunday morning. No answer. I told myself he was at the gym or asleep, or a dozen kind explanations a father builds for a grown man who doesn't pick up. I called again, Monday, voicemail. I texted, slow, one thumb at a time, hospital, had a small stroke. They're keeping me for tests. I'm stable. Call me when you can. And Monday evening my phone finally lit up with his name, and I answered. And I heard my son's voice for exactly 38 seconds, a number I know precisely because I looked at the call log later the way another man might look at an X-ray. He said, "Dad, that's really scary. I'm glad you're okay." And then he said, "Things are insane at the office right now. I'll try to get up there this weekend." And then, before I could even answer, there was a voice behind him, hers, saying something I couldn't make out, and Preston said, "Dad, I've got to run. Feel better. Okay, love you." Click. 38 seconds. I lay in that bed with Michigan on the ceiling and Yolanda's shoes squeaking somewhere down the hallway. And I did the thing every parent of a distracted, distant child has trained themselves to do without even noticing they're doing it. I built him an alibi out of scraps. He's overwhelmed. He hates hospitals since his mother. He said, "Love you." He almost never says that anymore. That has to mean something. I constructed an entire excuse out of nothing because the honest read on those 38 seconds had edges I did not want to touch yet. And meanwhile, and I mean this literally, while I lay there defending my own son in my head, here is exactly what my son was doing with his actual hands. On the third day of my hospital stay, a Tuesday, Preston walked into the downtown branch of First Traverse Trust Bank on Front Street, the same branch Gerald Ackers manages, with a folder under his arm and a story already rehearsed. He did not have a forged power of attorney, and I want to be precise about that, because what he did instead was, in some ways, sloppier, and in other ways far more calculated, and either way, it was going to matter enormously once the dust settled. He had a letter, a single-page letter, on the letterhead of a semi-retired general practitioner named Dr. Harlan Feld, a man who had been Carol Denning's personal physician for 11 years, and who, by the account that came out later, owed Carol a favour connected to a property dispute Carol had quietly smoothed over for him with a zoning board acquaintance. Dr. Feld's letter stated that he had, quote, reviewed Walter Brannigan's recent medical history and family history of cognitive decline, and had concerns, unquote, about my capacity to manage complex financial decisions independently, and recommended that a family member be granted, quote, protective oversight, unquote, of my accounts on a temporary basis pending further evaluation. Dr. Feld had never examined me. Dr. Feld had never once, in his entire career, laid eyes on me in an exam room. He had written that letter based entirely on a phone call from Carol Denning, describing a version of events that made a routine, fully resolved transient ischemic attack sound like the opening chapter of a long decline. And Preston walked into that bank with that letter and asked Gerald Ackers, a man who had known me for 22 years, to freeze my accounts and grant him emergency guardianship-style access to my savings, my full retirement accounts, and the business account for Brannigan and Sons citing my medical condition, and, in his own words on the request form, quote, long-standing concerns about his cognitive decline that the family has been monitoring privately, unquote. Long-standing concerns the family has been monitoring privately. Friends, I want you to sit with that phrase because there is a special shelf reserved somewhere for people who dress an ambush up as concern, and every single one of them reaches for a sentence exactly like that one. Here is what Gerald Ackers did instead of simply processing the request, and it is the reason I am not telling you a much darker story today. First Traverse Trust Bank has a policy, and Gerald followed it to the letter, that any request touching an account with a trust designation attached to it gets routed automatically to the bank's Trust and Estates Department before any human being at the counter can act on it, no matter who is asking or how urgent they claim it is. The moment Preston's request hit that queue, a flag came up on my file, the same flag Gerald mentioned to me on the phone, a flag that had been sitting quietly in that system for 2 years, since the spring after Nora died, waiting for exactly this kind of moment the way a smoke detector waits for smoke. The Trust Department pulled the documentation attached to my accounts, and what they found stopped Preston's request cold before it ever reached a supervisor's desk. And it stopped it in a way that had nothing to do with anyone in that bank doubting my son's story and everything to do with a piece of paper I had signed long before he ever needed it to exist. I did not know any of this was happening while it was happening. I was 6 days into recovery, walking laps around the cardiac and stroke unit with Yolanda timing me on her phone and telling me I was doing better than men half my age. And my son visited exactly once, on day 5, for 11 minutes, carrying a gas station bouquet of carnations and a look on his face that I read, at the time, as worry, and that I understand now looking back through everything that came out later, as a man privately doing arithmetic behind his own eyes about how much longer this particular delay was going to cost him. He asked how I was feeling. He asked if the doctors had said anything about, quote, next steps, in a tone that I mistook for concern about my recovery, and that was, in fact, him fishing for information about how impaired I currently sounded, information he could feed back to whoever was helping him build his case. I told him the truth, that I felt shaky but sharp, that the tests looked good, that I'd likely be discharged within a couple of days with blood thinners and a follow-up schedule. He nodded slowly, the way you nod at information you don't like, and he left after 11 minutes, and I lay back against the pillows and told myself, again, that he was overwhelmed, that hospitals frightened him, that I was lucky he'd come at all given how busy the firm kept him. I want you to notice, friends, how many excuses I was willing to manufacture for one man in the space of a single week. I had spent 41 years building things that don't collapse. I had apparently spent almost as many years building excuses for a son who was, at that very moment, standing in a bank 3 miles from my hospital bed telling strangers my mind was going. I was discharged on a Tuesday morning, 6 days after Beth found me on the asphalt outside the flower cooler, and my neighbour Sal Ferreira picked me up because Preston was, in his own text message, quote, slammed with a client thing, unquote. Sal Ferreira is 70 years old, a retired Traverse City police sergeant who lives on the next parcel over from mine on Centre Road. And the best thing I can tell you about Sal is that in the 18 years I've known him, he's never once knocked on my door without a genuine reason, and he has never once failed to knock when there was one. Sal was quiet on the drive home, quieter than usual, and twice he started to say something and stopped himself, and I chalked it up to him being careful around a man fresh out of the hospital. Then we turned onto Centre Road, and Sal said, real slow, Walt, I need you to know something before we get to your mailbox, and I need you to stay calm because your blood pressure doesn't need what I'm about to tell you. And he told me that Gerald Ackers had called him, of all people, an old family friend and a former cop, worried about doing the right thing without violating any banking rules, and had said just enough, carefully, legally, for Sal to understand that something involving Preston and my accounts had happened at the bank that week. I sat in Sal's truck in my own driveway, home from a hospital where I'd nearly lost the use of the left side of my body, and I learned that my son had spent that same week trying to have me declared incompetent. Let me tell you what I felt, because the order matters, and I promised this channel would always tell you the truth about the order. The first thing was not anger. The first thing was a strange, hollow disbelief, the mind's way of trying to make an ugly picture make sense some other way, a misunderstanding, some paperwork mix-up, anything at all but the plain true thing. And then the disbelief burned off the way morning fog burns off the bay, because Sal wasn't the kind of man who called something a fact unless he'd confirmed it 3 ways, and the true thing sat down on my chest heavier than the stroke had. And I'm going to say the next part plainly, because some of you watching have lived exactly this, and you deserve to hear another man say it, without dressing it up. I sat in that truck in my own driveway, home 6 days after the worst medical scare of my life, and for about a minute I did not want to exist anymore in a world where the boy whose initials were burned into my workbench could do what my son had just done. Not anything dramatic, just a bone-deep wish to not be present for whatever came next. If you have felt that particular minute, that freefall feeling of learning exactly what you're worth to your own blood, you are not weak, and you are not broken, and you are not the only one. It passes. And on the other side of that minute, for me, standing in my own driveway was a memory of Nora, 4 years gone, standing at our kitchen counter the year before she died, after Preston had let something slip about missing one of her birthday calls, and me saying, "Honey, let it go, he's just busy," and Nora looking out at the orchard with a voice I rarely heard from her and saying, "Walt, you keep defending that boy because you need him to still be the boy who burned his initials in your bench. He isn't only that boy anymore. Someday he's going to show you exactly who he's become, and you are going to have to decide in that exact moment whether you love him more than you love the truth." My wife had been gone 4 years, and she reached out of that memory and slapped me fully awake in the cab of Sal Ferreira's pickup truck. He had shown me who he'd become. The decision was here, and it turned out, friends, that I love the truth. The minute ended, and the cabinet maker showed up, because here is the thing about my son's fast, confident 38-second world, the world of men who talk quickly and sign quickly and count on nobody ever checking the joint underneath the finish coat. My entire working life had been spent checking the joint underneath the finish coat. 41 years of running my thumb along a seam looking for the place where two pieces didn't quite mate the way the eye wanted to believe they did. And I was looking now at a family riddled with exactly that kind of seam. Preston had tried to commit his ambush with paperwork, and paperwork happened to be my second language right behind sawdust. He had brought his 38-second world to a fight against a man who had once spent 2.5 years documenting stress fractures in church roof trusses, so fine most inspectors walked right past them, and he had done it while unknowingly handing me the exact two things I'd lost 6 days earlier on a grocery store parking lot. A reason to get my hands steady again, and someone to aim that steadiness at. I called Sal's brother-in-law, who did nothing. That's not a typo. I mean, I simply thanked Sal, went inside my own house, sat down at my own kitchen table, and picked up the phone to call the one person who had been waiting, quietly, for 2 years, for a call exactly like this one to arrive. Diane Kowalski, estate and elder law. An office on Front Street 2 doors down from a bakery that made the best cherry scone in 3 counties. The woman who had helped a grieving, careful widower do one boring, unglamorous thing back in the spring after Nora died. It rang twice. Diane, I said. Walt Brannigan. Are you sitting down? And Diane, God bless that woman, for the rest of my life listened to me talk for nearly 6 straight minutes without a single interruption, and when I finally ran out of words, there was a pause on the line exactly as long as it takes a person to set down a pen, and my lawyer said the 5 words I'm going to remember for the rest of my days, Walt. He picked the wrong account. So now it's time I told you the boring, careful thing, because I promised you at the start of this story that a document I signed 2 years earlier was the reason my son's plan fell apart before it ever really began. And I want to walk you through exactly what it was, because I believe some of you watching tonight need to go do the same thing this week, not someday this week. In the spring after Nora died, sitting in Diane Kowalski's office with a box of tissues on the corner of her desk that I'm fairly certain exists purely for widowers like me, I told her about my father. My father, Elias Brannigan, spent the last 6 years of his life sliding into vascular dementia, and I watched it happen slowly enough to know exactly how ugly it gets, and how easy it becomes for a family to start treating a man's forgetfulness as an excuse to make decisions for him long before any doctor has actually said the words "you're no longer capable." I told Diane I did not want that same slow erosion of trust to ever be turned into a weapon against me, by anyone for any reason. And Diane, who has practiced elder law in this county for over 30 years and has seen every version of this particular tragedy there is to see, told me about a structure most people have never heard of, and that almost nobody sets up until it's already too late to matter. We did 3 things that spring, and each one, alone, would have slowed Preston down. Together, they stopped him cold. The first thing was a revocable living trust, the Brannigan Family Trust, and into it, by properly recorded assignment, went the farmhouse, the 11 acres, the pole barn and shop, and every account I held at First Traverse Trust Bank, checking, savings, and the business account for Brannigan and Sons. From the date that trust was recorded at the Grand Traverse County Register of Deeds, Walter Brannigan, the man, no longer personally owned that property or held those accounts in his own name. Walter Brannigan, trustee, held them on behalf of the trust, and Walter Brannigan, trustee, was the only person on this earth with authority to move $1 of it, unless one very specific condition was met. The second thing was that specific condition, and this is the part my son never once thought to ask about, because he assumed, the way most people assume, that a power of attorney is the only document that matters in a situation like this. It isn't. A power of attorney makes you an agent for a person. It grants you exactly 0 authority over property or accounts that person no longer personally owns because they sit inside a trust. Preston could have shown up with the most bulletproof power of attorney ever notarized in the state of Michigan, and it would have been worth exactly nothing against those accounts, because he wasn't fighting a power of attorney question, he was fighting a trust question, and those are 2 entirely different legal universes that happen to look similar to somebody who has never had to learn the difference. The third thing, and this is the piece that truly finished the job, was something Diane called a standing capacity provision, built directly into the trust document itself, and I want to explain it plainly because I think it is one of the most useful tools I have ever heard of, and almost nobody uses it. The trust stated that no successor trustee, no family member, no court-appointed guardian, nobody could assume any authority over those accounts based on a claim of my incapacity unless that claim was certified in writing by 2 independent, board-licensed physicians who had personally examined me within the preceding 30 days, using a specific standardized cognitive assessment named in the document, neither physician being a relative, business associate, or personal friend of any beneficiary of the trust. And here is the detail that turned this from a strong provision into an actual trap for anyone foolish enough to try what Preston tried. Every single year, on the anniversary of Nora's passing, I drove myself to a neuropsychologist named Dr. Priya Anand in Traverse City and sat for a full cognitive battery, voluntarily, proactively, before anybody ever asked me to, specifically so that a dated, certified, gold standard record of my mental sharpness would always exist in the file, current within the last 12 months, no matter when trouble arrived. I had done this 3 times by the point Preston walked into that bank. The most recent evaluation was dated exactly 11 weeks before my hospital stay. Dr. Anand's letter, sitting in the trust file at First Traverse Trust Bank and in triplicate at Diane's office, stated in plain clinical language that I scored in the 94th percentile for men 15 years younger than myself across memory, executive function, and processing speed, and recommended no restrictions of any kind on my financial independence. So when my son walked into that bank with a letter from a doctor who had never examined me, based on a version of events fed to him secondhand by a mother-in-law who had overheard a phone call and decided to build a narrative around it, the trust department did not need to argue with him, did not need to call me, did not need a judge or a hearing. They simply pulled the file. 2 independent physicians examined within 30 days, standardized assessment named exclusion of anyone connected to a beneficiary. Dr. Harlan Feld had never examined me in his life, and he was, by virtue of the favour he owed Carol Denning, connected closely enough to a beneficiary of the trust that his letter would have been disqualified, even if he had. The request did not fail because a clerk felt sorry for me. It failed because 2 years earlier, in a quiet office on Front Street, a grieving widower had built a wall so specifically shaped that only one exact kind of key could ever open it, and my son had shown up holding a key that fit a completely different door. Diane told me all of this over the phone that Tuesday afternoon, walking me through it slowly the way you'd walk a man through a diagnosis, and I sat at my own kitchen table with 6 days of hospital exhaustion still in my bones, and I felt something shift inside my chest that had nothing to do with arteries. Relief, yes, but underneath the relief something colder and steadier settling into place because knowing the money was safe, knowing it had been safe from the very first phone call Preston made to that bank, did not answer the only question that actually mattered to me anymore. My son had not merely asked for help managing my finances. My son had manufactured a story about my mind failing, recruited a physician who had never laid eyes on me, and walked into the bank where I've kept my money for 30 years to tell strangers I was no longer capable of running my own life, 4 weeks after I nearly lost the use of my left arm in a grocery store parking lot. The house was never in danger. The money was never in danger. What was in danger, what I decided that afternoon I was going to go after with everything Diane and I could build together, was the truth sitting out in the open where my son could never again call it a misunderstanding. Diane said, "Walt, I want to be honest with you about our options. We can send a cease and desist to Preston and to Dr. Feld tomorrow morning, end this in 48 hours quiet and clean, or if you want it, we can let this breathe a little longer, gather more of the picture, and make sure that when this ends, it ends in a way nobody in your family ever tries again, not with you, not with anybody else they decide looks vulnerable someday." I thought about Carol Denning on my own back porch pricing out my remaining years like a used truck. I thought about 38 seconds. I thought about a doctor who had never met me putting his signature on a lie because he owed somebody a favour, and I said, "Diane, let it breathe. Let's see how far he's willing to go before anybody stops him. Now, before anybody in the comments starts telling me I should have shut it down that same hour, let me explain what letting it breathe actually meant. Because I want to be clear that at no point did I allow $1 to actually move, or one document to become something the trust department would have to unwind later. The account freeze request stayed exactly where it was, dead in the trust department's queue, permanently disqualified, going nowhere. What I let breathe was Preston's confidence, because here is the chessboard as Diane laid it out for me. The moment I called my son and screamed at him, which is exactly what the old version of me would have done, the story becomes a shouting match, my word against his, a confused old man fresh out of the hospital versus a clean-cut financial advisor and the physician letter he's holding. He apologizes, he cries at my kitchen table, he says, "Dad, I panicked, I was trying to protect you. Vanessa's mother scared me, I did it wrong, but my heart was in the right place." And some part of me, the same part that had spent 6 days building him alibis in a hospital bed, wants so badly to believe that story that within a year he tries some version of it again, smarter, on a father who is genuinely a little older and a little more tired the next time round. No, a crack you can see clearly is valuable information, and you do not spackle over valuable information. You put a little more weight on it, carefully, patiently, until it opens wide enough that nobody, not even the person standing inside it, can pretend it isn't there. So I gave my son and his wife exactly what they thought they wanted, which was an old man who had no idea what had happened at the bank. When Preston finally found a Sunday to visit, 9 days after the incompetence letter, gas station carnations again, second bouquet in 2 weeks, I want you to sit with that detail. I opened my door, and I was exactly the man he needed me to be. Slower, a little foggy, grateful for the company. He came up the walk, and I watched him scan my face for any sign that I'd heard from the bank, and I gave him nothing, and he visibly relaxed inside about 90 seconds, and my son sat at my kitchen table for an hour asking me gentle, probing questions about my memory, whether I'd been keeping track of my medications, whether I'd noticed myself forgetting things lately, and something moved behind his eyes each time I answered a little slower than I needed to. I called him Bud twice, which had been my own father's nickname for him as a small boy, and then caught myself slow on purpose, the way a fish looks like it's slipping the hook right before it truly does. I told him the same story about Yolanda, the night nurse, 10 minutes apart, word for word. I let him notice my truck keys sitting in the refrigerator, which I had put there myself that morning for exactly this purpose, and his face when he found those keys, you would have thought the man had struck oil in his own backyard. He hugged me at the door before he left, first real hug in over a year, and said, "Dad, I want you to know I've got this handled," and I felt something go cold and quiet in my chest, where affection for that version of him used to live, something I genuinely cannot fully describe to you even now. I shut the door behind him, walked out to the shop, and I made a small engraved plaque out of a scrap of cherry wood, the kind of thing I used to make for anniversary gifts, and it said, "Keys do not live here, Bud." And I hung it on a nail inside the refrigerator door where it still hangs today. A man has to keep himself amused during a war, friends, or the war eats him from the inside before the enemy ever lands a real blow. I needed eyes inside that household, and this is where I have to properly introduce you to the two people who made the rest of this possible, because nobody wins a fight like this one alone, and anybody who tells you otherwise is selling something. First, Sal Ferreira, retired police sergeant, the man who drove me home from the hospital and told me the truth in my own driveway. From that week forward, Sal, who golfs with a man named Ronnie, who happens to be Gerald Ackers's brother-in-law, and who happens to also know a fair number of people around downtown Traverse City through 30 years on the force, kept a quiet, informal ear to the ground, not asking anyone to break any rule, simply noticing things the way retired cops notice things everywhere they go for the rest of their lives. And second, my granddaughter, Maddie, Preston and Vanessa's daughter, 15 years old, and here I need to slow down and be honest, because this next part is the single piece of this entire story I would handle differently if I could do it all again, and I promised you the truth the whole way through, so here it is. Maddie plays violin, seriously, all-state audition level, and wants to study music therapy someday, and she had been texting me all through my hospital stay, real questions, worried ones, the only member of that household who ever asked what the doctors actually said instead of what it meant for anybody's plans. In late October, she rode her bike nearly 6 miles out Centre Road, told her mother she was at a friend's house practicing duets, and sat at my kitchen counter eating the last of some cherry pie like she was 12 years old again. And out of nowhere she said, "Grandpa, why does Mum keep telling Grandma Carol you're not doing well? Careful now." I said, "What do you mean, sweetheart?" And Maddie said, "I heard her on the phone last week. She said once the account thing goes through, Dad can finally breathe, and then we can figure out what to do about Grandpa long term. Figure out what to do about Grandpa long term." 15 years old, and I watched her hear her own sentence land in the room, and watched her quietly decide something about her mother in real time and friends, I did not recruit my granddaughter as an informant. I want that on the record clearly. I never once asked her a follow-up question. I never had to. From that afternoon forward, Maddie simply told me things unprompted because children raised inside a house like that one develop, in pure self-defense, the most sensitive radar in the world for what's rotten. And somewhere in that 15-year-old chest she had already picked her side. On the 6th of November, Diane called me, and her voice had that flat, careful courtroom tone I'd already learned meant something significant was coming. "Walt," she said, "2 things. First, the Trust Department formally denied the incompetence request in writing yesterday, cited insufficient physician documentation, and the denial letter went to Preston by certified mail this morning. Second, and this is the part you need to hear clearly, my office received a call an hour ago from an attorney representing Dr. Harlan Feld, who apparently received a copy of that denial letter as a courtesy from the bank's counsel, and is, in her words, extremely concerned about his professional exposure. Walt, this is moving faster than either one of us expected. Are you ready for what happens next?" I stood at my kitchen window looking out over the orchard. Bare now, the cherry trees stripped down to black branches against a grey November sky, and I thought about 38 seconds. About a doctor who signed a lie for a favour. About a 15-year-old girl folding her voice down small at her own dinner table because it was the only way she'd ever learned to survive it, and I said, "Diane, book the room. Before I take you into that room, I owe you the dinner because the dinner is where I very nearly lost this entire war in one unguarded second, and you deserve to know exactly how close it came." 2 weeks before that November call, Vanessa phoned me herself, which was rare enough on its own that I should have paid closer attention to the omen in it. "Walt," she said, in that warm, honeyed voice she reserved for waitstaff and elderly relatives she considered assets. "We haven't had you over in ages. Come Sunday. I'm making a roast. Maddie misses you." Using my granddaughter as bait. Noted for the file, as Diane liked to say. Now, understand the position I was in. The correct move for Walt the plaintiff, so to speak, was to decline, stay home, protect the performance from unnecessary risk. But the correct move for Walt the performance was to go, because a foggy, uncertain old man who suspects nothing does not turn down a Sunday roast from his own family. And if I started declining invitations, somebody in that townhouse might start wondering exactly what the old man actually knew. So Sal drove me in, cover story being that my neurologist hadn't cleared me for long drives yet, which was not entirely true. I was cleared for anything short of operating a table saw, but it put a witness in the driveway and gave me a clean exit on a timer if I needed one. I walked into that townhouse at 5 o'clock with a store-bought pie, because Nora's molasses cookies felt like too much armour to bring into a room like that one. And I want you to picture the still life waiting for me on the coffee table, not hidden away, not tucked in a drawer for later use, displayed, fanned out like magazines in a waiting room. 3 glossy folders, Cedar Grove Assisted Living, Bay Point Memory Care, and a third one, the one that stopped me cold for a half second I had to fight to hide, whose cover read, in letters I can still see when I close my eyes, Harbour House, a community for cognitive care, your story, gently held. Your story, gently held. Somebody with a marketing degree got paid real money to write that sentence, friends, and I hope they're proud of it, because I certainly am not going to forget it. I looked at those folders, and Vanessa watched me look at them over the rim of a wine glass, exactly the way a scientist watches a rat find the lever. It was a test, and everything about that evening was a test. I understood that within the first 10 minutes. The roast was a test. The seating was a test. They put me in the chair with its back to the room, the disoriented elder chair, a detail I only recognised as deliberate weeks later when Diane pointed it out from something similar she'd seen 100 times. Preston asked me twice whether I'd been managing the stairs okay out at the farmhouse, a house I designed myself specifically as a single-storey build because Nora's grandmother had broken a hip on a staircase, and Nora never wanted to live with one. Carol was there too, of course, working the room right alongside her daughter, and Carol spent the appetizer course talking loudly, to no one in particular, about a client of hers, poor thing, who had waited too long to get her affairs handled, and the family lost so much in the confusion afterward. It's always better, Carol said, spearing a piece of cheese with a toothpick to get ahead of these things, while everyone can still participate in the conversation. I am 67, friends, not 91, and I had walked 2 miles that very morning as part of my recovery routine, and I sat in the disoriented elder chair with gravy congealing in front of me, and listened to these people conduct my own estate planning in the future tense, out loud, at a table paid for by a mortgage my own son could only make because of a career I'd funded the education for. And I want to tell you about the one single second where it nearly all came apart. Maddie was telling a story about her violin instructor. A sweet, ordinary story. It doesn't matter what it was about. And Vanessa cut her off mid-sentence, flat, not even cruel about it. Just administrative, honey. The grown-ups are talking, and turned back to Carol to continue itemizing my remaining years. And Maddie folded. 15 years old, sharp as a tack, and I watched my granddaughter fold her one story back up and set it down in her lap. Practiced, no surprise at all on her face, and the lack of surprise was the part that did it. Because no surprise means this happens every time, and something behind my sternum that no cardiologist had ever needed to examine went white hot, and I felt my mouth start to open, and I swear to you the sentence loaded and ready to fire was, "Your mother prices out an old man's remaining years, and you speak to your daughter like she's furniture in front of me." And if that sentence had left my mouth, the entire war would have ended right there. The performance dead, weeks of careful architecture gone for one hot second of feeling righteous. What saved it, and I am not exaggerating even slightly, was a breathing pattern a physical therapist had taught me after the stroke for exactly this kind of surge. 4 counts in, hold for 4, out slow, and the drill kicked in a half second before the sentence did. Pure trained habit, and by the top of the exhale the cabinet maker had the wheel back, and instead of the sentence I knocked my water glass over, on purpose, in slow, clumsy, old man motion, directly into the folders on the coffee table. Cedar Grove took most of it. Harbour House got the rest, the ink on that beautiful cover starting to bleed almost immediately, which felt like the single most satisfying accident I have ever staged in my life. I did the flustered apology. "Oh, for heaven's sake, look at me, somebody grab napkins." And in the commotion I caught Maddie's eye for 1/4 of 1 second and I winked, and my granddaughter looked at the ruined folders and looked back at me, and 15 years at that particular dinner table had taught that girl a poker face that would have done well in a casino. But I saw it land. Grandpa's still in there. Grandpa saw everything. "You're not imagining this, kid, and you're not alone in this family." We ran an entire quiet resistance on that exact frequency for the rest of that fall, one wink and one ruined water glass at a time. In Sal's truck afterward, he asked how it went, and I said, Sal, they had brochures for memory care facilities laid out like a magazine spread, and Sal, who spent 30 years reading rooms for a living, was quiet for almost a mile, and then said the most cop thing I've ever heard out of him. He said, "Good. Now you've seen exactly what exit they've built for you. Go build a better one." Which brings me to the 3 nails, friends. The 3 things that turned a denied bank request into something no lawyer in 3 counties would ever agree to defend. Nail 1, and I still can't decide if it's the saddest detail in this whole story or the one that finally let me stop making excuses for my son entirely. My grandfather, Silas Brannigan, worked on the Great Lakes freighters for 30 years, and he carried a pocket watch through every one of those years, a Hamilton Railroad grade watch he bought with his very first paycheck in 1946. And that watch passed to my father, and my father gave it to me the week Preston was born, and it had lived in a small cedar box in my shop office for as long as my son had been alive. That watch left my house during the 6 days I was hospitalized, along with a coin collection and my late father's service medals, all of it removed with the same emergency key Preston kept for true emergencies. On the second Saturday after the bank denial, a pawnshop owner on 8th Street named Dwayne Kessler, who happened to golf occasionally with Sal and who Sal had quietly asked months earlier, purely as a favour, to keep an eye out for exactly this kind of thing, called Sal, who called me. Walt, a fella matching your son's description, came in Thursday with a railroad pocket watch, wanted a fast cash offer, wouldn't leave it on consignment for a proper appraisal. Dwayne, sharp as they come, told him a watch of that provenance needed authentication, take 2 weeks, took his information off the intake slip, Preston Brannigan. His own legal name, Friends, on a pawnshop intake form for his own great-grandfather's railroad watch, less than 3 weeks after the bank had already told him in writing that his incompetence claim had failed. Sit with that. The money he'd hoped to access was already gone, the door already closed, and he still couldn't stop his hands from reaching for something else that wasn't his to sell. That's the detail the courtroom never really fixes. That's just who he had let himself become. There had been a version of that week, right up until Dwayne's phone call, where some quiet corner of my heart was still drafting a version of events, where I gave my son one last private chance to hand everything back and start over. That phone call burned the draft completely. You can try to have me declared incompetent through a bank and I will fight you like a man fights any lawsuit. You pawn my grandfather's railroad watch while doing it, and we're in entirely different weather. Nail 2. Dr. Harlan Feld. Here is a thing most people watching this don't know, and Preston, a licensed financial professional who deals with compliance paperwork every single day of his working life, absolutely did know, which is exactly what makes it so damning. A physician's letter used to support a claim of incapacity in a legal or financial proceeding is subject to review by the state medical board if a formal complaint is filed, and any physician who signs such a letter without conducting an actual examination is exposing themselves to real professional discipline, not a slap on the wrist. Discipline that can end a medical license outright. Diane, through channels that are frankly none of my business and that I did not ask too many questions about, made certain that a calm, entirely factual letter reached Dr. Feld's own malpractice insurance carrier, simply noting that a formal grievance regarding the October letter was under serious consideration and inviting voluntary cooperation before matters proceeded further. Dr. Feld had never examined me in his life. His letter either constituted a fabricated clinical opinion, one serious violation, or a genuine but reckless diagnosis rendered without any examination whatsoever, a different serious violation, and either way it torched his credibility on every letter he had signed in the last decade. By Wednesday of that week, Dr. Feld had retained his own attorney, separate entirely from Carol and Preston, and that attorney called Diane's office to ask, hypothetically, what full cooperation might look like going forward. The wall wasn't merely cracking anymore, friends. The wall was calling us collect, begging to switch sides before the roof came down on it too. And nail 3, the one I built myself, and it remains my personal favourite because it cost exactly the price of one stamp. You'll remember Preston had access to certain of my mail during his brief emergency key privileges, and I had reason to believe from a comment Maddie made offhand that he was still occasionally checking my mailbox himself, under some flimsy pretense about picking up a package for me. A man who reads your mail believes he's reading your mind, so Diane and I fed the mail. We composed a single letter on the letterhead of a fictional independent trust review office in Grand Rapids, addressed to me, care of my own address, which I made certain sat visibly in my mailbox the one afternoon I knew Preston was stopping by unannounced to, in his words, check on me. Annual Trust Review, Brannigan Family Trust. And buried in the middle of a page of dense grey boilerplate language, one sentence with a hook in it, per your inquiry, we have deferred discussion of the successor trustee designation pending your update to the beneficiary schedule, and remind you the amendment window closes at the end of this calendar year. Beneficiary schedule. Amendment window. To a man who had already tried and failed once to get at those accounts, that paragraph reads exactly one way. The old man is quietly changing who inherits everything, and there is a clock running on it. By that Tuesday evening, Maddie sent me, entirely on her own initiative, I want to be clear about that once again for the record, a photograph of a sticky note on the townhouse kitchen counter in her father's handwriting, and the note said, "Call Mom, year-end deadline," and every single conversation that followed ran, we learned much later, through Preston's own personal cell phone and email, disinterested carriers, storing every message exactly the way carriers do, stacking up paper trail precisely the way Diane wanted. My son spent that final week absolutely convinced he was racing a shrinking window before his father quietly wrote him out of everything. There was no amendment window. There was no trust review office in Grand Rapids. There was only page 4, friends, and the old man who had always lived there. There is one more thread I have to pull for you before we get to that Friday morning, because it explains a great deal about the pressure that had been building on the other side of this whole story, and it came to me almost by accident, the way the truest details in a story like this one usually do. A woman named Renee Kapoor called Diane's office out of nowhere in the middle of that final week, identifying herself as Vanessa's former business partner in the wellness studio, a partnership that had apparently dissolved 18 months earlier under circumstances Renee described carefully as not entirely amicable. Renee had heard, through the particular grapevine that exists among small business owners on a peninsula, where everybody eventually knows everybody, that there was some kind of legal matter developing between Vanessa's family and mine, and she wanted, in her own words, to make sure the full picture was available to whoever needed it, because she had walked away from that studio partnership having personally absorbed nearly $20,000 of shared debt that Vanessa had assured her, in writing, would be handled jointly, and never was. Diane took the call carefully, recorded it with Renee's full knowledge and consent, and asked only factual questions. What emerged was a pattern that went back further than I had ever realized. Vanessa had, according to Renee, floated the idea of, quote, restructuring the studio's finances using family resources, unquote, as early as 2 years before any of this reached my bank, long before Preston ever made his first phone call to me about contingencies. Renee had refused to participate in whatever that restructuring might have involved, not knowing the details, only that it made her deeply uncomfortable, and the partnership had ended shortly afterward. I want to be fair here, because Renee herself was careful to say she had no direct knowledge that Vanessa had specifically been planning what eventually happened to me, only that the appetite for using someone else's money to solve the studio's problems had existed for years, quietly, waiting for the right pressure and the right opportunity to arrive at the same time. Diane filed the call away, mostly as colour, mostly as confirmation of a pattern rather than new evidence of any specific crime. But I'll admit it changed something in how I thought about the whole architecture of what had happened to me. This had never been a single bad decision made under acute stress. This had been a slow-simmering appetite, years in the making, that had simply been waiting for a hospital bed and a doctor willing to sign a favour. I also have to tell you about the conversation I had with Maddie the week before the conference room, because I think it matters just as much as anything that happened in that glass-walled office, and because I owe you the honest version of how a 15-year-old actually absorbs news like this rather than the tidy version. I sat her down at my kitchen table on a Tuesday after school, Sal's wife having driven her out under the pretense of helping me organise the shop for winter, and I told her, plainly, in language, I tried hard to keep age-appropriate without insulting her intelligence, exactly what her father had done. The letter, the bank, Dr. Feld. I did not mention the pawn shop yet. That detail I held back for later, because even I recognised some things needed to arrive in a particular order for a young person to absorb them without shattering entirely. Maddie sat very still through all of it, the same stillness I would see again weeks later in my own great room, and when I finished she asked one question first, the same instinct that would surface again on the day of the confession. She asked, "Is Grandma Nora's money safe? Not is Dad in trouble, not what happens now, but is the money, the specific concrete thing she understood to represent her grandmother's memory, safe?" And I told her, yes, sweetheart, it was safe the entire time. It was never actually at risk for one single day. And Maddie sat with that a while, turning her water glass in slow circles on the table, the way I do myself when I'm working through something difficult. And then she said, "So he tried to steal from a dead woman's memory to fix a problem he made himself." And friends, I want you to understand, I did not put those words in that child's mouth. I've never once described it to her in those terms. She simply looked directly at the architecture of what had happened, and named it more precisely than I had managed to in months of turning it over in my own head. I said, "That's about the size of it, yes." And she said, "Okay, I need you to win. Not for you, for the money that's actually Grandma's." And I promised her I would. And I want you to know that promise mattered to me every single day of that final week leading up to the conference room, more than almost anything Diane and I built into the actual legal strategy. The night before, I didn't sleep much, and I won't pretend otherwise. I sat in Nora's chair on the back porch with a blanket and my dead wife's opinion of me for company, watching the last of the leaves come down off the orchard trees in the dark, and I'm going to tell you the thing I said out loud to nobody, because this channel exists to tell the truth. I said, "Nora, I know exactly what I am about to do to our son tomorrow, and I know it's just, and I would trade every bit of it for one honest knock on that door tonight. Dad, I did something terrible. There's only 6 words." He had one more evening to say them. The phone log will show you exactly what he did with it instead. At 11:17 that night, Preston texted me, the last message before everything came down. "Hey Dad, thinking about you, let's grab dinner soon. Vanessa found a great new place downtown." He was tucking me in, keeping the Mark warm for one more day, entirely unaware the Mark had already built the whole trap around him months earlier. I set the phone face down on the porch railing, and friends, the strangest peace settled over me, The peace you feel when the final load test finally comes back and you know completely exactly what the structure is capable of, all the way down. No more hoping the numbers were wrong. The numbers were never wrong. In the morning I put on the grey suit I'd worn to Nora's funeral, because some clothes carry a message all their own, and Sal drove me into town through a light snow that had started overnight, and neither of us said one word the entire drive, and I loved him for that silence more than I could ever properly thank him for. At 9:45 we walked into Diane Kowalski's office on Front Street, where the conference room had been arranged for what the calendar politely called a family financial mediation, and where the receptionist, expecting a routine sit-down, looked up and watched the following procession come through her glass doors. A widower in a funeral suit, Diane Kowalski and a paralegal carrying 2 bankers' boxes of documents, a court reporter hired for the morning setting up her steno machine at the head of the table, and Sal Ferreira, retired police sergeant, standing near the door with his arms crossed like the building itself might try to leave before this was finished. Down the hallway, through the glass wall of the conference room, I could see them already seated. Coffee cups, phones out on the table, Carol in a blazer she clearly considered armour, Vanessa scrolling something on her phone, and my son at the head of the table with a legal pad in front of him and a pen in his hand, leaning back in his chair, laughing quietly at something on his own phone, easy, half a second ahead of whatever the joke was. He hadn't seen us yet. I stood in that hallway for one last second and watched my boy laugh, and then Diane opened the conference room door, and Preston's chair came down onto all 4 legs at once, and I watched the colour leave my son's face the way water leaves a cracked pipe, and I said, "Good morning, everybody." I understand there was some concern about my mind. Nobody moved for a solid 4 seconds, and 4 seconds is a very long time inside a glass-walled room. Carol recovered first because commission instincts die hard even outside real estate, and she came up with a bright, brittle, "Walt, what a surprise, we weren't expecting. This is really more of a private family." And Diane set the first banker's box down on the table with a sound like a gavel coming down and said, "Sss, Denning, I'd encourage you to think very carefully before you finish that sentence, because you are about to tell the trustee of the Brannigan Family Trust that a meeting concerning fraudulent claims made against his own trust is a private family matter he isn't welcome at." The word trustee moved through that room like current through a rail. Vanessa's phone came off the table and into her lap fast enough that it nearly slid off her knee, and Preston, my son, said, "Dad, just that, Dad." I've thought for a long time now about how to describe what was actually in his voice on that one syllable, and the honest answer is arithmetic. It wasn't guilt. Not yet. It wasn't fear for me. It was a man watching every number he'd built the next several years of his life around suddenly turn red, all at once, on the same screen. I did not answer him. I'd promised myself in Sal's truck that whatever happened in that room, "Walt, you speak to the room, never to the boy, because the boy you're looking for isn't fully in that chair anymore, and you'll break your own heart searching for him mid-sentence." I pulled out the chair at the far end of the table, directly across from my son, and the funeral suit sat down, and I said, "Is it Preston who wants to explain the letter, or should we start with Dr. Feld's version first?" And then Diane went to work, and friends, I've spent my whole life watching skilled craftsmen do their trade, master joiners, finished carpenters who could make an 1/8-inch gap disappear into a shadow line so clean you'd swear the wood grew there naturally, and I would put Diane Kowalski in a room with every one of them. She didn't raise her voice once. She unpacked, document by document, in a flat, calm, almost gentle tone, sliding each one across the table where everyone, and especially the court reporter, could see it clearly. The recorded trust assignment from the spring after Nora's passing, dated and stamped by the County Register of Deeds, the standing capacity provision, highlighted, read aloud in full, requiring 2 independent physicians with no connection to any beneficiary. Dr. Priya Anand's most recent cognitive evaluation, dated 11 weeks before my hospitalization, scoring in the 94th percentile, no restrictions recommended. Dr. Harlan Feld's letter, placed directly beside it, and the disclosed fact, now confirmed in writing by Dr. Feld's own retained counsel, that Dr. Feld had never examined me, not once, in any capacity, at any point in his career. And then, last quietly, the pawnshop intake slip from 8th Street, Preston's own signature on the line marked customer, his great-grandfather's railroad watch itemized above it in Dwayne Kessler's careful handwriting. Nobody in that room breathed for a moment, and Diane squared the stack of papers, calm as a Sunday morning, and said, "And before we discuss what my client intends to do with this file going forward, he'd like to say a few words to the room." "Thank you, Diane." I stood up. "I'm old-fashioned that way. I believe a man ought to stand for something like this." And I looked at the three of them, my son, his wife, her mother, the entire architecture of the last 2 years, and here, as close as I can give it to you from memory and from the court reporter's transcript, which I have read more than once since, is what I said. I said, "I'm going to talk for about 4 minutes, which is roughly 6 times longer than my son spent on the phone with me from a hospital bed after I nearly lost the use of my left arm. Vanessa, you may want to put the phone away entirely." I said, 38 seconds. That's what I got, day 3, a mini-stroke, 6 days in the hospital, and things are insane at the office, Dad. And I built you excuses for that call, son, lying in that bed with half my face still numb, because that's what fathers of only sons do. We are the last free defense attorneys you will ever have. I said, and while I was busy building you those excuses, you were walking into my bank with a letter from a man who has never once examined me in his life. A letter you knew, because you deal with compliance paperwork for a living, would never survive one serious look from a licensed professional. You called it protective oversight. The bank's own file calls it what it actually is, and Preston's head came up sharply at that phrase, and I watched him glance, just once, toward Vanessa, and I watched her look back at him with something that was not quite panic yet, but was clearly doing the arithmetic of panic, and ladies and gentlemen, that exchange look right there was the exact moment I believed that marriage started dying. Weeks before either one of them would admit it out loud to anyone. I said, "And you told that bank, in writing, on an official form that the family had, quote, long-standing concerns about my cognitive decline that we've been monitoring privately, unquote. Long-standing." Son, 11 weeks before that letter, I sat for a full neuropsychological evaluation, voluntarily, the way I have every single year since your mother died, and I scored higher than men 15 years younger than me. There was no decline to monitor. There was only a debt schedule you needed solved quickly, and a father you had already quietly decided was more useful to you diminished than trusted. I said, and while your request was sitting there, denied, dead, in a queue at the bank, you went to a pawn shop on 8th Street and you tried to sell your own great-grandfather's railroad watch. The same watch he carried across the Great Lakes for 30 years. The same watch I put in your hands the week you were born, planning to hand it to you again someday when you were ready to carry something that heavy. You signed your own name on that intake slip, Preston. Not a fake name. Your name. I want you to sit with that, because everyone in this room can do the math on how close you thought you were to money that was never once actually within your reach, and you still couldn't stop your hands from grabbing at something else. I turned to Diane briefly, just to let the room breathe for a second, and then I turned back and said the last part slow, because I had earned the right to say it slow. As for the 3 of you, every road out of this room runs through a door I built, quietly, 2 years before any of you ever needed it to exist. Behind one door, Dr. Feld's medical board hears the full details of an unexamined incapacity letter this week, and the State Attorney General's Elder Abuse Unit hears about an attempted incompetence filing built on that letter the same week. Behind the other door, we handle everything in full in one signed agreement on my terms, no negotiation, and what happens to each of you afterward gets decided by 2 things I have left to give: the law, and whatever remains of my mercy. And I would not, I said, gathering my coat, count too heavily on the mercy. It's been rationed carefully for about 6 weeks now. Sal, I'm ready to go. And I walked out past the receptionist, who was holding her coffee cup with both hands like a woman watching a car accident happen in slow motion, and I made it exactly to the truck. And then, friends, because this channel exists to tell the truth even about the parts that don't make a man look strong, I sat down in the passenger seat of Sal Ferreira's pickup in the falling snow, and I cried the way I hadn't cried since the morning after Nora's funeral. Both kinds at once. The kind for what my son had actually done, and the kind for how completely, thoroughly, correctly it had all just gone. If you don't understand how those 2 feelings can live inside the same 60 seconds, I hope with everything in me that you never have to learn. Now the fallout, because I promised you consequences at the start of this story, and around here we settle our accounts. The agreement got signed, of course it got signed, because Dr. One had a state medical board and an elder abuse unit behind it, and Preston was a licensed financial professional beautifully aware of exactly how radioactive both of those phrases were for his career. His new attorney, his second attorney, since the first firm he called declined the engagement after running a conflicts check that apparently raised its own eyebrows, spent one grinding 8-hour Thursday advising total, complete surrender. Here were my terms, and Diane told me afterward they read less like a settlement and more like as-built drawings, which I chose to take as the highest compliment a lawyer has ever paid me. 1. A full written confession detailing every step of what happened, signed, notarized by an actual independent notary we selected ourselves, sealed alongside the court reporter's transcript in Diane's vault, with non-prosecution on the elder abuse and fraud fronts conditioned entirely on every other term being met, and the seal breaking permanently the moment any term was breached. 2. Doctor. Harlenfeld voluntarily surrendered his medical license rather than face a full-board hearing, citing health reasons in the official filing, a phrase I've come to find almost darkly funny given how often it gets used by people whose actual health was never the issue. 3. Cal Denning's real estate license went under formal review after Diane forwarded documentation of her involvement in soliciting the fraudulent letter, and Carol resigned it voluntarily before the board could act and quietly stopped taking new listings altogether. 4, and this is the term that mattered most to me personally, Preston was permanently barred, by signed instrument, from ever serving as agent, trustee, executor, or fiduciary of any kind for me, in any capacity for the rest of my life. And when you sit with what that sentence actually requires a man to sign about his own father, you understand it's the whole story compressed into one clause. 5. Full restitution of every legal cost I had incurred, the evaluation fees, the court reporter, Diane's hours, repaid on a strict schedule over 30 months. And 6. The term Diane herself argued with me about longest, the one Preston's own attorney reportedly read twice and said, "He wants what exactly?" I required my son to tell his daughter the truth, himself, out loud, all of it, with me present in the room. That was the price of whatever mercy I had left to offer. And I'll tell you why in a moment, and I'll tell you what Maddie said when he finished. Because my granddaughter's response in that terrible hour is the reason this story, for me, ends in daylight instead of in ash. People ask me, off the record, at the hardware store or across a poker table, what the single worst day of this whole thing actually was. They expect me to say the driveway, or the hospital, and those certainly make the short list. But I always give the same answer, and it surprises them every time. The worst day was the Thursday. The 8-hour Thursday, 10 days after the conference room, in the second-floor meeting room at Diane's office when we papered the surrender. Because the conference room at Diane's office that first morning had adrenaline running through it, it had architecture. I'd rehearsed it in Sal's truck for weeks beforehand. The Thursday had none of that. The Thursday was just a long table, coffee going cold in paper cups, a stack of documents thick as a phone book, and my only child sitting across from me for 8 straight hours while lawyers read him, clause by clause, the itemized bill for what he had tried to do to his own father. You know what 8 hours of that sounds like? It sounds like pages turning, that's all. Underneath it, barely audible, the sound of a man's plans for the next several years of his life being quietly disassembled and inventoried in front of him. His attorney, a tired, decent man named Preger, coincidentally, had apparently told him that morning, "Sign everything. Preston, they have you on the medical board complaint and the elder abuse statute both, and there's no fight left worth having." And so there was no fight left in the room at all, and somehow that made it worse. A fight I might have actually enjoyed a little. This was simply demolition, conducted by checklist, with breaks for the restroom. Vanessa did not come in. I want that noted clearly, and I want you to picture it, because I have thought about it more than I probably should. 8 hours, and his wife, co-architect of at least half those clauses, the tape measure eyes from that very first Thanksgiving, the once the account thing goes through comment Maddie overheard, sat the entire day in the parking structure across the street in her own car. Maddie was in school, so this comes second-hand from Diane's paralegal, who could see the structure from the office window and clock the vehicle there at 9 in the morning and still there at 4 in the afternoon. Never came in. Not to sit beside her husband, not to face me, not even to hear the full term she was partially responsible for. My son took all 8 hours alone, and every so often his phone would light up on the table, face up. He never did learn to turn it over, and even from my end of that long table you could feel the energy of those messages arriving, short and frequent, incoming like sleet. Status. What did you agree to? What's happening? At one point, hour 6 or so deep into the restitution schedule, Preston glanced at his phone, then out the window toward the parking structure, then at me, and friends. For 2 or 3 seconds, my son and I had an entire conversation with no words in it at all, the most honest one we'd had in over a year, and what his face said in that window was, "You see it too, don't you? You've seen it this whole time." And what my face said back was, "Son, I saw it the very first Thanksgiving she walked through my front door, and the tragedy of your life is that she saw you coming before I ever did. 3 seconds." Then his phone lit again, and he went back down into the pages, and the moment closed over the way water closes over a dropped tool. Gone. But I know exactly what I saw. Somewhere in hour 6 of the worst day of his life, my son ran the numbers on his own marriage, and unlike every other calculation that man had made in the last 2 years, this time the math came out clean, and he knew it. Vanessa filed for divorce 11 days later anyway. Of course she did. People like Vanessa always file first. It was never really about the marriage itself, it was about controlling the story. And first to the courthouse is first to write the narrative, a lesson Carol had apparently taught her daughter the same way other mothers teach a good pie crust. There's one more scene from that surrender day I owe you, because if I'm honest, it's the reason this whole chapter exists in my memory at all, the reason I couldn't skip past that Thursday. Late in the afternoon, the watch came back. Term of restitution, physical return of all removed property, itemised against Diane's list. And Prager had it carried in himself, my late grandfather's Hamilton Railroad watch, set on the table for verification against the inventory, and Diane read down the list: coin collection, present, service medals, present, and then pocket watch. And there was a pause, and Preston said, quietly, "It's still at the pawn shop. The 2-week hold isn't up until Friday, and that detail was already known and scheduled and accounted for. But here is the thing I did not expect." My son reached into his own jacket pocket and took out a folded slip of paper and slid it across the table to me directly, not to either attorney, and said, "That's not part of the agreement. That one's just yours." And I unfolded it, and it was the pawnshop receipt, the original, 8th Street, the date, Dwayne Kessler's careful blocky handwriting itemizing the watch, and the line where it says customer name, Preston E. Brannigan, and friends. He could have let that piece of paper simply die in a drawer somewhere. No clause of the agreement required its surrender. Diane confirmed later we had never actually asked for it. It was the one document nobody remembered to demand. He handed me the physical evidence of his own shame, unprompted, in the middle of 8 hours of coerced signatures, the single entirely voluntary act of that entire day. I keep a file at home now of every document from that whole ordeal: the trust assignment, Dr. Feld's letter, the capacity evaluations, the settlement, all of it. An entire small war contained in one drawer. The pawnshop receipt is in there too, but it lives in its own separate envelope, and on that envelope, in my own handwriting, it says, "Evidence of the other thing." Because a legal case needs documents that prove exactly what a man did, and a father, it turns out, needs one document that proves what was still left standing inside him while he did it. I'm not saying that receipt balances anything out. My grandfather's watch does not get cancelled out by one folded slip of paper. I'm saying I spent 41 years believing what load tests tell you, and at 4:51 that Thursday afternoon, with everything already lost and nothing left to gain from it, one beam inside my son held. Just one. You build the rest of the structure from the beam that holds. There's never been another way to do it. He signed the final page at 6:30 that evening. Diane's associate notarized it. A real notary this time, and nobody in that room made the obvious joke out loud, though I could tell everyone was thinking it. And then everyone stood up with that terrible shuffling cocktail party awkwardness that seems to end even wars, and Prager packed his briefcase, and my son stood at the conference room door with his coat over his arm, wrung out grey, easily 10 years older than he'd looked in October, and he turned around, and I watched him search for a sentence. The sentence. And there isn't one. I could have told him that myself. I'd spent 8 hours failing to find it from my own side of the table. And what he finally said, exhausted, hand resting on the doorframe, was, "The gutters at the farmhouse, on the north side, they'll be full by now. I always used to help you clear them in November. Don't get up on that ladder yourself, Dad. Hire it out, take it off what I owe you," and he left. And Diane, packing her own bag, not looking up, said, in that dry voice she uses for exactly these moments, "Walt, 30 years in this business, and that's about the closest thing to an apology I've ever seen hold up afterward." Gutters. She wasn't wrong either, and for the record, neither was Preston. The gutters were, in fact, full. I hired it out. It's on the restitution spreadsheet entry for November gutter service, credited against the balance. Same drawer, friends. I keep telling you that. Same drawer. It happened on a Sunday, 9 days after the conference room. I chose my own house on purpose, and I chose the great room on purpose, under a ceiling I'd framed myself, with the whole grey orchard filling the windows, because if a thing is going to be said, let it be said in the house Nora and I actually built our life inside of. Preston arrived alone, which was itself something of an event by that point. Vanessa had, quote, a scheduling conflict, and the conflict, Maddie told me later with an expression like a court filing, was that her mother had spent the morning at Carol's kitchen table with a legal pad because Vanessa had already moved from grief straight into portfolio management, and the asset under a review that particular morning was the marriage itself. Maddie came separately, violin lesson first. Sal's wife drove her out. My granddaughter walked in, looked at her father sitting on the edge of the couch in a collared shirt like a man interviewing for something, looked at me, looked at the folder sitting on the coffee table and said, "Somebody died, right? That's the energy in this room," and nobody laughed, and she sat down and went very still, the particular stillness of a kid who's been waiting for a shoe to drop her whole life and has just heard the lace start to slide. I won't give you every word of it. Some of it belongs only to the 3 people who were actually in that room, and I believe if you've stayed with me this long in the story, you're exactly the kind of person who understands why. But I'll give you the shape of it. It took my son almost 40 minutes. I had one rule, which I told him at the door before Maddie arrived. Complete sentences, Preston. No passive voice. Mistakes weren't made. You made them. Say the verbs. And credit where I have very little credit left to give, he said, the verbs. I lied. I forged a story about you. I tried to pawn Grandpa's watch. He got through the letter and the bank visit and the mail in that flat recitation voice men use when the only way through something is to render it as a report instead of a confession. And then he got to the watch, the part I hadn't scripted for him, because there are things even the most careful planning can't draft in advance. He looked at the floor of the house he'd grown up helping me build and he said, "Maddie, there's a pawn shop on 8th Street. And his voice went, and he had to stop, and my granddaughter, 15, sitting 3 feet away with her arms crossed, did not move one muscle to help him along, and neither did I. And the orchard outside did not move either, and the 3 of us sat inside that silence, while a grown man tried to find the sentence. I attempted to sell your great-great-grandfather's watch, and could not manage it, and started over twice, and finally got it out. And Maddie, who had been a statue for almost 40 minutes straight, said her first word of the entire afternoon. She said, "Why, not to me, to him." And Preston, and I believe this was the only moment in that entire year where my son told the complete truth on the very first try, said, "Because I was drowning, and I decided it was easier to try to take from your grandfather than to admit to anyone that I couldn't swim." Sit with that sentence, friends, because that sentence is this entire genre of family catastrophe compressed into 20 words, easier to take than to admit. That is the engine underneath every story like mine that you have ever heard on this channel, or lived through at your own kitchen table. It was never actually about the savings account. The account was simply the biggest thing his panic could reach, and here is why I made the confession a mandatory term of the settlement, why I refused to let them soften it for Maddie, why an old man spent his last bargaining chip on 40 minutes of unfiltered truth. 2 reasons. 1, Maddie was about to watch her household come apart regardless. The townhouse would be sold that spring, the divorce would be filed in February, and children who watch a collapse without ever being given the actual load numbers will quietly assign the failure to themselves. I've seen it my whole life in families the same way I've seen it in trusses. The failure gets blamed on the wrong member of the structure. She needed the real numbers. It was never her fault. It was never even, in the final accounting, truly about the money. It was about a man who chose deception over honesty because honesty felt to him like drowning. And 2, colder and truer, I wanted my son to lose the version of himself that still lived in his daughter's eyes, the easy laughing father who arrived half a second ahead of his own jokes, because that version of him was the getaway vehicle, and I had told you from the very beginning of this channel, I serve it frozen. He walked out of my house that evening owning every verb in front of the only audience he had left that still mattered to him. When the door closed behind him, Maddie sat looking out at the orchard for a long time, and then my granddaughter delivered 11 words I promised you earlier, and I have them exact because some sentences you simply do not paraphrase. She said, "Grandpa, can I still love him while he's paying you back?" And I said, "Sweetheart, that's the family business." Those are the 11 words, and that's the exact moment I knew this girl was going to be all right. Better than all right, because at 15 she had already found the door it took me 67 years and a small stroke to find myself. Both things, the love and the bill. Same drawer, now, the winter, and I want to be honest with you about it, because too many stories on other channels cut straight from the confession scene to a warm holiday montage, and it's a lie, and you didn't subscribe to this channel for lies. That winter was hard. Vindication, it turns out, heats a room for maybe a week. Then it's just you, a paid-off farmhouse, a phone that mostly stays quiet because you burned the one number that used to light it up most, and a cherrywood plaque on your refrigerator that made you laugh in November and doesn't quite land the same way by January. I'd won everything that mattered on paper. The trust was secure, the restitution was arriving on schedule, door 1 had stayed shut, the confession sat sealed in Diane's vault like a round kept in a chamber. And some nights I sat in Nora's chair with the porch light off and asked her flat out, "Nora, tell me the truth. Did I build a case or did I bury our son?" And the orchard never answered. Orchards never do. Yolanda called me twice that January, unprompted, just to check in, and I want to tell you about the second call specifically, because it taught me something I hadn't expected to still be learning at 67 years old. She asked how I was really doing, not the answer you give people, the actual answer. And I told her about the winter, the quiet house, the plaque on the refrigerator that had stopped being funny. And Yolanda, who has sat with more dying and more grieving families in that cardiac unit than most people sit with in a lifetime, said, "Walt, you did the surgery. Now you have to let the wound actually heal, and healing looks boring compared to the surgery. That's just the truth of it. Nobody ever put a movie together about the boring part." She said, "My patients who do best after something like this aren't the ones who feel triumphant. They're the ones who let themselves be a little bit bored and a little bit sad at the same time, without deciding it means the surgery failed." I sat with that for a long while after we hung up, out on the porch with a blanket over my knees, even though it was far too cold to reasonably be out there, and I thought about how much of my working life had been spent explaining to worried homeowners that a repaired structure doesn't look dramatic afterward. It just quietly holds weight the way it's supposed to, and how strange it was that I had needed a night nurse to explain the exact same principle back to me about my own life. I wrote that sentence down on an index card and taped it inside a kitchen cabinet where I'd see it every morning making coffee. Let the wound heal. Boring is the goal. Vanessa's divorce filing came in February exactly as expected, and I learned through Maddie, who narrated that entire spring with the calm, detached tone of a nature documentary host, that her mother's opening financial position attempted to characterize a portion of Preston's legal debts to me as, quote, marital waste, dissipation of shared assets, unquote, meaning Vanessa sought compensation from Preston for money. Preston was actively repaying to the very man Preston had tried to have declared incompetent, partially at Vanessa's own urging in the first place. The nerve required for that argument does not rise and fall the way ordinary boldness does. It sits at a permanent plateau. It's practically geological. Preston's second attorney, in a filing I have replayed in my own head more than once, simply referenced the sealed underlying circumstances of that debt and invited the family court to unseal them at opposing counsel's convenience, and the marital waste claim evaporated within the week, which tells you Vanessa's own attorney had finally been briefed on exactly what sat inside that vault. Carol listed her own condominium in Sutton's Bay that same season, citing market conditions, and the agent who ended up with that listing was a younger woman who had taken over most of Carol's old client book after the license review. And if you believe that particular piece of timing was purely coincidental, you have not been paying close attention to how small towns keep their books. They invoice slowly, friends, but they invoice. Christmas, that first winter, deserves its own few minutes, because Christmas belonged entirely to Maddie, and because it taught me the last lesson on the syllabus, the one about what winning a war like this actually buys you afterward. She asked to spend it at the farmhouse. First Christmas after the whole structure came down, custody schedule still fresh ink, and the family negotiations ran hot for a solid week. Maddie to me to nobody, Maddie to her father to his attorney, to Diane to me, the modern family in miniature, and the final arrangement read as follows. Christmas Eve and Christmas morning at the farmhouse with Grandpa. Her mother had her from noon onward on Christmas Day. Preston got the 26th. A teenager's holiday split 3 ways like a contested estate, and the child herself negotiated most of the actual terms, 15 years old, carrying the whole arrangement on her back along with her violin case and her school backpack. And if you want to understand the true cost of what Preston and Vanessa did, it isn't on any spreadsheet Diane keeps. It's that itinerary, written in a sophomore's careful handwriting, taped to my refrigerator right next to the plaque about the keys. She arrived on the 23rd in Sal's wife's minivan with enough luggage for a small expedition, took over my kitchen within the hour, and announced we were doing everything, Grandpa everything, and I asked her to define everything, and she produced, I promise you I am not exaggerating even slightly, a laminated schedule. The girl laminates things. I genuinely do not know where she picked up that particular habit, except I know exactly where she picked it up, because Nora laminated the tornado safety plan for a house in northern Michigan that has maybe seen one real tornado warning in 37 years. Cookies, item 1 on the schedule. Nora's molasses cookies, recipe card kept in the same tin it's always lived in, her grandmother's handwriting on it, and Maddie read that card like it was scripture, and then looked up at me with her mother's ambition and her great-grandmother's eyes and said, "We're tripling the recipe." We tripled the recipe. Flour on every surface of that kitchen. Flour on Sal's dog chief, who winters wherever the food happens to be. Flour genuinely everywhere. Tree, item 2, and not just any tree, a cut-your-own from a farm out on Bluewater Road. And I stood in snow up past my ankles holding the saw, while a 15-year-old reviewed 6 acres of balsam fir like a general inspecting troops, rejecting candidates for posture, for gaps in the branches, for one memorable veto, vibes, and the tree we finally cut down was objectively too large for the room. We both knew it standing right there in the field, and we took it home anyway. Because Nora always went too big too, it runs in this family, the women in it apparently believe ceilings are more of a suggestion than a rule. It scraped the beam going up the front steps. It was the best tree I've had in years. Item 3, lights on the pole barn, which had not been strung since Nora passed. Because a man alone does not typically put up lights on a barn by himself. That isn't sadness exactly, that's just physics. Some jobs genuinely require 2 sets of hands and one person laughing at the other one up on the ladder. We lit the barn. Sal came down for the actual flipping of the switch, and Chief barked at his own reflection in the frozen puddle by the door, and from the kitchen window, that string of lights strung along the barn eaves looked exactly, precisely, like it looked the last Christmas Nora was alive to see it. And I had to step inside for a minute, and Maddie let me have that minute without a word, and had Coco waiting when I came back out, and neither of us said one thing about any of it. And that, friends, is the entire skill set required for loving a grieving person properly. Coco. No commentary. Christmas morning she gave me a mug, hand-thrown in her school's ceramics elective, glazed the exact grey-green of the bay in late October, with a thumb dent placed precisely where a thumb wants to rest, and on the bottom, scratched in before firing, it read, "World's okayest trustee." I laughed until Chief got genuinely concerned about me. It's the good mug now, the one I drink my coffee from on the porch most mornings, and now you know exactly why I call it the good mug and change the subject quickly. Some inventory items in a man's kitchen carry classified files, and I gave her the letter. I had thought hard about what a girl gets from her grandfather during the Christmas her family fell apart, partly because her grandfather counterattacked, and money felt wrong to give, and things felt wrong to give, and eventually I did the only honest thing available to me. I wrote it all down. Everything. A long letter, in longhand, 3 separate drafts, about her great-great-grandfather's watch coming home across the Great Lakes, about her grandmother Nora at a county fair lemonade stand pretending not to notice a boy who couldn't stop ordering lemonade, about her father at 11 burning his initials into a workbench because he wanted to belong in that shop next to mine, and about how the same boy grew into the man who did what he did this past year, and how both of those people were, and always will be, entirely real, and that her only inheritance that actually matters, the one nobody in this family has ever managed to steal from anybody else, is the plain, boring, load-bearing habit of telling the truth early, while it's still cheap before it compounds into something none of you can afford. And at the bottom I wrote, your great-great-grandfather carried that watch through 30 years on the water, and it always came home. People can too. Be patient with your father. Be careful with your mother. Be exactly who you already are. She read it twice at the kitchen table with her cocoa going cold, and then she folded it back into its envelope and looked at me and said, I'm keeping this forever, you know. And I told her I was counting on exactly that, and she said, also I'm framing the part about the watch for my dorm room someday. and I told her to negotiate the licensing rights with Diane, and that's when we both completely lost it laughing. And Chief started barking again at nothing in particular. And somewhere, friends I'm certain of it, a woman in a green cardigan was watching flour dry into the grout lines of her own kitchen, and a tree that was far too big scrape her ceiling beam, saying, "Well, Walt, took you long enough. Fill it," I said, out loud to an empty kitchen. I didn't say with what. She always did have to have the last word. Merry Christmas, Nora. We managed. Noon arrived on Christmas Day the way noon always does, whether you're ready for it or not, and Vanessa's car idled in my driveway at 11:58. She didn't come to the door, and my granddaughter packed up her entire expedition of luggage and hugged me hard enough at the threshold to test whatever was left of my recovering circulatory system, and went off to the second shift of her split holiday, waving out the back window the whole way up the drive. And the house went quiet all at once, the way it does, like a tide pulling out. I sat down in the great room with the tree lights still on at 1 in the afternoon, an old man and a paid-off farmhouse, and a cooling kitchen that smelled like tripled molasses cookies. And I'm not going to dress this part up for you. I sat there a long while. Winning, friends, this is the part the revenge channels always skip, and I promised you I wouldn't. Winning gets you the accounts, the schedule, the sealed vault, the quiet porch. It does not get you noon on Christmas not hurting anymore. Nothing gets you that. You just build the days that can bear the weight, one at a time, cookies and cocoa and barn lights, and you thank God for laminated schedules and a retired cop's loyal dog, and you keep the drawer. Both things in it, always. All winter long I kept catching the smell of molasses in odd corners of that kitchen, weeks after she'd gone back to school, and every single time, I swear it on Nora's own recipe tin, it landed like a hand resting gently on my shoulder. The house remembers who fills it. Build accordingly. I want to tell you one more small thing about that Christmas, because it's the detail I find myself returning to most often when I tell this story now. On the morning of the 26th, after Maddie had gone to spend her day with Preston, I found a second, smaller envelope tucked behind the flour canister, easy to miss unless you were looking, addressed simply to Grandpa in her handwriting. Inside was a single index card, and on it she had written, in the same careful hand as the letter I'd given her, 3 words and a date. "We are okay." Followed by that day's date, December 26th, like she was logging a data point in an experiment she intended to keep running for the rest of her life. I have that card in the same drawer as everything else now, the trust documents, the pawn shop receipt, the settlement, all of it. And some mornings, when the file feels heavier than usual, I take that one card out first, before any of the rest. Because a 15-year-old girl with a laminator and a stubborn streak inherited from 2 generations of Brannigan women had already figured out, faster than any lawyer or any doctor or any spreadsheet ever could, the only measurement that actually mattered in the end. Spring came late that year, the way it does on the old Mission Peninsula, the last hard frost holding on stubbornly through most of April, before finally giving up one warm afternoon all at once. And with the thaw came the strangest chapter of this entire account, the one nobody ever properly warns you about, the chapter where the person who wronged you starts paying you back on schedule, and you have to figure out exactly what that makes you now. The first restitution transfer arrived the first business day of the month on time, and the second, and the third. Say what you will about my son, and I've said most of it by this point, the man had spent his career around amortization tables, and he treated that debt with a professional discipline he'd never once managed for the man he owed it to. There was a spreadsheet. Diane received it monthly, my name in his own ledger, his handwriting in a file that used to only ever contain my mistakes, and now increasingly contained his corrections of them. He sold his share of the townhouse that May, once the divorce finally settled, and took a small rental over in the Slabtown neighbourhood, and someone at his firm had apparently heard something. Someone always hears something in a town this size, and his path toward a senior advisor went quiet for a while, and he started handling smaller accounts. First-time homebuyers mostly, longer hours for less money. And I know all of this the way I knew everything else that year, which is to say through Maddie, whose custody schedule made her something like a dual citizen with full diplomatic immunity, reporting from both capitals with a scrupulous fairness that would have made a UN observer proud. Dad's apartment is kind of sad, Grandpa, but he actually cooks now, real meals, and he watches your videos, and then she caught herself, because that's a slightly different story. She said he watches channels like the ones you like. Mum has a new boyfriend, he owns a boat dealership, he laughs at literally everything. It's exhausting. Grandma Carol does homestaging now, which mostly means she rearranges other people's furniture and calls it strategic vision. 15 going on 50, that girl. She spent a good part of that summer out at the farmhouse with me. Learned to drive Sal's old stick-shift truck around the church parking lot. Played her violin on my porch one evening in July, some slow, aching piece I couldn't name, out over the orchard while the light went long and gold, and Sal and his wife walked down their own lawn just to listen, and I sat in Nora's chair with my coffee going cold, thinking, well, Nora, look at that. Filled. You always did want it filled. We took the long way around, house is full, and then it was August, and the workshop happened. I was out in the pole barn on a Saturday afternoon replacing a worn belt on the old table saw, and Preston came by. Unannounced, which was against the choreography, every other visit that whole year had run through Maddie like a switchboard operator, and I heard tyres on the gravel and looked up, and it was him, alone, standing beside his car in weekend clothes with 2 coffees from the gas station balanced in a cardboard carrier, looking at the farmhouse the way a man looks at a headstone he isn't quite ready to read yet. I let him stand there a good while. Then I went back to my belt because I'm 67 years old and a worn drive belt doesn't replace itself, and after a few minutes his shadow crossed the doorway of the barn, and my son stood in that shop for the first time since before his letter to the bank, and neither of us said anything, and a breeze moved through the open door and then he saw it. The workbench, the initials his and mine burned in with a soldering iron the summer he turned 11. And I watched my boy reach up and rest his thumb against that burned wood exactly the way I do without ever thinking about it. Exactly. Same slow drag of the thumb across the letters, and I understood he had been running his own thumb over some version of that bench all year too, somewhere in his mind if not in fact. He said, I keep trying to find the exact day it started. Like if I could just find the one day I could, and he stopped talking. I said, you can't reverse engineer a collapse from the wreckage, son. I've tried that my whole career. Best you ever really get is a list of contributing factors. He almost laughed. Didn't quite. Handed me one of the coffees. We drank gas station coffee in that barn, not talking much for 20 minutes or so, and then he said the only thing from that entire visit I would put in a permanent file. He said, I'm not going to ask you to forgive me because the spreadsheet's not finished, and you taught me a long time ago that you don't sign off on work that's still in progress. And he got in his car and left. And friends, I stood in that barn doorway watching his taillights disappear down centre of road. The same taillights I'd watched from a doorway I'd been performing feebleness behind not even a year earlier. And I'll tell you exactly what I felt. And you can make of it whatever you like, not forgiveness. Nowhere close to it yet. But for the first time in 2 years, when I looked at that man, the arithmetic behind his eyes was finally pointed inward, at himself, instead of outward, at what he could still extract from somebody else. That isn't redemption. That's just the site inspection that has to happen before anyone finds out whether the ground will ever hold a structure again. But every rebuild I've ever worked on in my life started exactly there, and nowhere else. Now let me step outside the story for a few minutes because I promised some of you, back when I started this channel, that every one of these stories would leave you with more than just a satisfying ending, and there are people watching this tonight in the middle of their own version of it, phone lit up in a dark room, and this next part is for you specifically. Write these down. Lesson 1. The trust did all of the actual heavy lifting. Understand this clearly. If my accounts and my property had simply been held in my own name, with nothing more than a will sitting in a drawer somewhere, my son's incompetence letter, backed by even a mediocre physician willing to sign something vague, could very plausibly have frozen access to my own money for months, while I fought through a guardianship proceeding to prove I was still entirely capable of running my own life. A revocable living trust with a properly built standing capacity provision costs less than a decent used snowblower to set up. While you're alive and sharp, it changes absolutely nothing about your day-to-day life. You can still sell property, refinance, change every term of it on a Tuesday afternoon if you want to. But nobody, not your children, not their spouses, not a mother-in-law with a real estate license and a grudge, can ever use a claim about your mind against property that trust legally holds, provided the document is written correctly from the very start. Every person over 55 listening to my voice right now, and I know from the comments that's most of you, ask yourself one honest question tonight. Do you know exactly how your accounts and your property are actually titled? If you don't know for certain, you don't know, and Monday morning call the attorney you've been meaning to call for 3 years. It took my son 3 days to try to take nearly everything, and it took one properly built document from 2 years earlier to stop him cold before he ever got close. Lesson 2. If a family member is ever going to claim incapacity against you, make sure long before that day arrives that the claim requires exactly the kind of proof that's genuinely hard to fake. 2 independent physicians, no connection whatsoever to any beneficiary. A standardized named assessment, not a vague letter written from second-hand gossip. I have now shown you over the better part of 2 hours exactly what a family member desperate enough will actually attempt when the door looks even slightly open. Build the document so that door simply isn't there. Lesson 3. The cracks were visible the entire time, every single one of them. The tape measure eyes at that very first Thanksgiving. The photographs Vanessa used to take of rooms in my house when she thought nobody noticed. The porch conversation about how many years I might have left. The Wednesday phone call about contingencies. I logged every one of those cracks in my own memory, and I load tested exactly none of them for years because I was lonely, and because grief makes a man generous in precisely the wrong directions. Kindness without any inspection behind it isn't love, it's deferred maintenance. And deferred maintenance is how good structures eventually kill the people standing inside them. And lesson 4, the one that cost the most to learn. When somebody finally shows you the arithmetic, believe the arithmetic. 38 seconds was the entire confession, day 3, if I'd only had the stomach to read it plainly at the time. Everything that came after was simply the paperwork catching up to a truth that had already arrived. Before I take you to the watch coming home and the second Thanksgiving, let me clear the mailbag, because I've told this story enough times now. At Sal's poker table, once at a church breakfast, I got gently ambushed into speaking at, and the same 6 questions always come up. And a couple of you are probably already typing them right now. I can feel it. Question 1. Always first, always a little too eager. Walt, why didn't you have him prosecuted? You had the medical board complaint, the elder abuse statute, you had him dead to rights. Why choose the settlement instead? Fair question, and here's the honest answer, and it isn't a noble one, so brace yourself. Prosecution was never going to give me back one single thing I'd actually lost. Walk it through with me. The money was never truly at risk. The trust saw to that from the very first phone call. Full prosecution turns restitution into a maybe. Pennies collected slowly from a man whose career would likely be over entirely, whereas the settlement turned my son's remaining earning years into my own private collection agency, and that's simply math, not mercy. But the real reason is Maddie, and I'll say it plainly. A criminal case makes her the girl whose whole family ended up in the newspaper over elder fraud, 15 years old, walking the halls of a high school in a town where Carol had sold half the teachers their houses over the years. The settlement makes her the girl whose family had, quote, some legal trouble, unquote, vague, survivable, hers to explain or not explain for the rest of her own life on her own terms. I bought my granddaughter's privacy with my own personal satisfaction, friends, and on the days the anger still comes back, and it does still come back, some random Tuesday, a stranger's 38-second phone call in a movie will do it. On those days I remind myself exactly what that satisfaction would have cost, and who would have actually paid the bill for it, and the anger sits back down. Mostly. I've told you this channel tells the truth. Mostly is the truth. Question 2. What happened to Dr. Feld and the whole medical board situation? Cleanest resolution of the entire file, honestly. He surrendered his license before the board hearing could even be scheduled, and I understand he's since retired fully to a cottage up near Charlevoix, and I genuinely hope the man spends the rest of his days thinking hard about what a favour is actually worth. Question 3. People want more consequences for Carol. There's an appetite out there for mother-in-law justice that frankly concerns me a little bit, if I'm honest. I've told you the broad strokes, license surrendered voluntarily, staging consultations in a strip mall now instead of closings on waterfront property. But you want the detail that actually satisfies, and I have it, because small towns do invoice, remember. The Kellerman cottage 2 coves down from my place. The one Carol used to cite constantly as her favourite comp. It sold again last spring. Biggest listing on that stretch of shoreline in almost a decade. Exactly the kind of commission that used to belong to Carol by something like divine right. It went instead to the young agent who inherited most of Carol's old client list after the license review. A genuinely nice woman named Monica, who I've since met at exactly one open house I attended purely out of spite, and she had a sold sign up on that property within 3 weeks. Sal drove past Carol's little staging storefront the following Monday, purely by coincidence, Sal says. Sal is a liar, and reports the window display had been rearranged 4 separate times that same week. Furniture moving furniture, friends, that's the entire obituary right there. Some justice arrives as a verdict. The best kind arrives as a younger woman's sold sign, visible from your own strip mall window, indefinitely. Question 4, and this one always comes quieter, usually from the back of a room, usually from a man about my own age holding his coffee cup with both hands. Walt, did you ever actually visit one? The places, the brochures, Harbour House specifically, and I know exactly why he's asking, whoever happens to be asking, because the folder on his own coffee table has his kid's fingerprints on it too, and he wants to know what I found out. So here's what I did, and I recommend it to every single one of you in that particular position. 6 months after the whole ordeal, entirely on my own initiative, on a Tuesday nobody chose for me, I drove myself to Cedar Grove, walked in the front door, and asked for the full tour. Voluntarily. The woman at the front desk very nearly fell out of her chair. Apparently the demographic doesn't often show up under its own power asking questions. And I'll tell you exactly what I found. Because fair is fair, it was fine. Clean, kind staff, a genuinely decent woodshop out back where a resident named Walt, no relation, small world, was building birdhouses, and we talked joinery for the better part of an hour, and I've been back to see him twice since. We're planning a canoe rack together come spring. It's not a prison, friends. That was never the actual point and never has been. That Walt chose Cedar Grove, sold his own house on his own terms, signed his own paperwork, waves at his own daughter every single Sunday from his own porch there. The building itself was never the crime. The crime was 3 people at a dinner table planning to file me away in one while I still had the receipts, the mileage and the mind, purely because my continued independence had become inconvenient to somebody else's cash flow problem. Same building, entirely different circumstances. Write this down somewhere, friends. It is never actually about where they want to put you. It's only ever about who's holding the pen. That Walt holds his own pen, I hold mine. That's the whole civil rights movement of getting older, right there, in one sentence. The pen. Question 5. The channel itself. How does a retired cabinet maker end up doing this? The microphone, the stories, the porch recordings. Blame Maddie. Like everything genuinely good that's happened to me in the last 2 years. She heard me tell the poker table version of this story last summer. All of it. The water glass. The plaque on the refrigerator, page 4, and she sat on my porch afterward and said, "Grandpa, do you realise there's like a dozen channels of guys pretending to be exactly you?" And I asked what she meant by that, and she showed me her phone, and friends, she was entirely right. There they were. Silver-haired thumbnails scrolling past forever. Actors reading somebody else's script, production companies who have clearly never held a grudge or a chisel in their lives, monetizing my entire demographic's worst year for content. And something about that got under a cabinet maker's skin in a way I didn't expect. Not the money side of it, the tolerances. The stories were out of spec. The paperwork in them was always wrong. The emotional beats were wrong. Everybody forgives everybody within about 19 minutes flat. And not one of them ever mentions what noon on Christmas actually feels like afterward. So Maddie set up the recording equipment, ceramics elective money paid for half of it, that kid, and she edits the audio herself from her dorm now, some kind of audio engineering elective. They seem to have an elective for absolutely everything these days, and the arrangement between us is simple. Every story true where it counts, names changed, documents real, and whatever the channel earns splits 3 ways. Her tuition, a scholarship fund for Yolanda's daughter down at Central Michigan, and the rest into an account at the county legal aid office that covers filing fees for seniors who found their own version of a sign in their own yard and can't afford a Diane Kowalski of their own. It's called the Page 4 Fund. I wanted to name it something with Nora in it, and Maddie said, "Grandpa, Grandma would hate that. Put her into the actual work, not on the letterhead. 15 going on Nora, that girl." So no, friends. This channel was never a retirement plan. It's the load test, published for anyone who needs it. It's one man's ass-built drawings, in case your own structure ever takes a similar hit, so you'll know exactly where the beam held, and where it cracked, and which crack, caught early enough, saves the whole span. Question 6 can wait a little longer. Question 6 is the one about forgiveness, and I've been quietly dodging it this entire story, and I'm going to keep dodging it a few more minutes because the watch came home in September, and I want you standing right beside me at Dwayne's counter when it does. The watch came home in September, almost exactly 1 year to the day after that pain first hit the side of my head in a grocery store parking lot. Dwayne called Sal, Sal called me, And there was a whole ceremony about it because Dwayne Kessler is nothing if not a man who understands ceremony. He would not mail it. He would not simply hand it off through Diane's paralegal. He required, his word required, that I come down to 8th Street in person. And when I did, he had that Hamilton Railroad watch sitting on a black velvet tray under the counter glass like the crown jewels of Grand Traverse County. Cleaned, the crystal polished, the case oiled with a typed authentication card in a plastic sleeve and a handwritten note clipped to it that read, "No charge for the hold. Tell your grandfather's ghost we kept good watch over it." I did not leave that shop dry-eyed, and I didn't try particularly hard to. Dwayne walked me out to the truck carrying the case himself like a pallbearer, and shook my hand on the sidewalk and said, "For what it's worth, Walt, the day your boy brought this in, he sat out in his car for a good 20 minutes first." I watched him through the front window, both hands on the wheel the whole time. I've been doing this 30 years. The ones who sit in the car like that, sometimes they find their way back eventually. The ones who walk straight in whistling never do. I don't rightly know why I'm telling you that. He knew exactly why he was telling me that. Pawnbrokers, night nurses, friends, the two most accurate character witnesses God ever stationed along the entire length of the human condition. Thanksgiving then, the second one, the one that actually counted, you'll remember what the first one looked like over a year earlier, right in the thick of the whole ordeal. Me alone at that same table with a turkey breast about the size of a softball, and Sal's wife sending a plate down the road out of pure pity. This one I cooked properly. Full bird, Nora's recipe card propped against the flour canister, where it has supervised every turkey that Kitchen has ever seen. Sage and butter, and the neck simmered slow for gravy exactly the way she always swore by. Maddie came Wednesday night and stayed over, in what she now calls her room outright, no longer the guest room, practiced her scales at 7 in the morning as what I consider a genuine war crime against a sleeping veteran of actual medical drama, meaning me. Sal and his wife came at 2. Yolanda came too, that's right. The night nurse from the hospital, because we'd stayed in touch. I send a small check her daughter's way every semester for books, over Yolanda's repeated objection, and when she pushed back harder than usual, I reminded her that a man who nearly lost the use of his own arm under her watch is entitled to distribute a little of his own estate early, to people who talk to him about ordinary things at 3 in the morning when ordinary things were exactly what he needed. And at 4 o'clock, headlights on the gravel. Preston, invited, and I'll tell you exactly how that invitation came together, because it was the very last negotiation of this entire saga. Maddie brokered it, naturally, the family switchboard operator to the end. He'd been asking her, careful, sideways, whether he should even bother, whether Grandpa would actually want him there, and I took the phone right out of my granddaughter's hand mid-sentence. First time I'd dialed his number myself since before the hospital, and my son answered on the very first ring, and I said, "Preston, one condition, you carve." And there was a silence on that line about the length of a man leaning his forehead against a doorframe somewhere, and my son said, "I'll bring my own knife," and that, ladies and gentlemen, was the entire peace treaty. 4 words and a carving knife. He stood at the head of Honora's table, right where I put him, and he carved that bird his mother's way, thin against the grain, and his hands shook on the first cut and nobody said a single word about it, and by the 3rd slice they'd steadied. Maddie watched her father the whole time with her chin resting on her fist, filing every bit of it away for whatever memoir she'll absolutely write someday. And Yolanda told a story about a patient who once tried to sneak out of the cardiac ward to catch a hockey game, no names given, though the patient in question was sitting right there at that table. The restitution spreadsheet, for the record, stood at 58% that particular week. Nobody mentioned it once at dinner. Both of us knew the figure down to the decimal anyway. Same drawer, friends, the love and the bill. You learn eventually to keep them together in the same drawer. I'd love to tell you the story simply ends there, everybody hugging, roll the credits. But I owe you 2 more pieces, one bitter and one sweet, because that's roughly the ratio life actually tends to pour out. The bitter piece first. Vanessa. You'll want to know, and I understand the wanting. The divorce finalised that October, and the marital waste argument, the one attempting to bill Preston for robbing me inefficiently, did not survive contact with the judge, particularly once Preston's attorney invited the court to review the sealed circumstances at opposing counsel's convenience. The claim evaporated inside a week, which tells you Vanessa's own lawyer had finally been fully briefed on exactly what was sitting in that vault. She has the boat dealership boyfriend, the exhausting laugh, and a new fitness concept, Carol's word for it, concept, tucked into a strip mall in Sutton's Bay, and I genuinely, truly wish her a long and healthy life at a comfortable distance, the way you wish a passing storm well once it's finally moved on to some other county. She never apologised, not once, not through anyone, not even second-hand through Maddie. And here's the mature thing I'm supposed to tell you, that I've made complete peace with that. And here's the actually true thing instead. Some accounts simply get written off, friends. Not forgiven. Written off. There's a real difference. Any accountant will confirm it for you, and the difference is you stop expecting the payment to ever arrive, but you keep the entry in the ledger anyway, and that entry is exactly why that particular woman will attend no funeral of mine. Maddie may make her own arrangements about that in her own time. That's her ledger to keep, not mine. And the sweet peace. It arrived in June, an envelope with a university crest on it, forwarded from Preston's rental because she'd used her father's address for the application. A thick envelope, and everyone knows what a thick envelope like that usually means. But that isn't actually the sweet part. Hold on. Michigan State. Pre-veterinary track. That girl had told exactly one living soul which schools she was even seriously considering, and the soul was me. Over cocoa on my porch back in February, sworn to a level of secrecy she outlined in considerable detail beforehand. The sweet part is what fell out of the envelope when I opened the card she'd tucked in alongside the photocopy of her acceptance letter. A photograph. Herself at maybe 5 years old, in a life jacket roughly the size of a mattress, standing on my dock, on Preston's shoulders, both of them soaked through and howling with laughter. Nora's shadow with her sun hat thrown long across the boards in the corner of the frame because Nora was the one holding the camera. I'd never once seen that particular photograph. It had apparently lived in Vanessa's cloud storage for a decade like a hostage nobody thought to ransom. Maddie had gone digging and rescued the family history herself, spent a good part of spring break at it, she told me later, pulling every photo of the farmhouse in the bay out of her mother's old albums before the boyfriend's boat photos buried them entirely. And on the back of the photograph in 15-year-old ballpoint pen she'd written, "Grandpa, this is what you were actually defending. See you at Christmas. Fill the house." That last part, Nora. She signs things like you now. I don't have a next sentence ready for that one, friends. Some paragraphs you just leave a porch chair empty for a while. Let's sit in it together a second, and then I'll bring us on home. So here we are. It's early morning as I record this last part for you, out on the porch, second cup of coffee, the good mug, the bay doing that thing it does in the fall where the mist stands up off the water, like the whole shoreline is breathing slowly in and out. The gutters, in case anybody's wondering, got cleared professionally again this year, right on schedule, credited against a balance that keeps shrinking on a spreadsheet neither of us mentions out loud anymore. The house is quiet, but it's the good kind of quiet now, the between visits kind. Maddie's spare violin stands still sitting in the corner of the great room, a folding card table that's hosted 3 separate poker nights since spring, Yolanda's daughter sending me a photograph of her first semester textbooks with a little heart drawn next to the tuition receipt. And somewhere in a small rental over in Slabtown right now, my son is awake early, the way he always used to be as a boy, 62% as of the 1st of this month, drinking his own coffee in a small kitchen, working his way down a debt that was always about so much more than the actual dollars involved. Do I trust him again? No. Let's be honest with each other, you and I, we've come this far together. Trust was the very thing he forged, and unlike a signature, I can't lay out 30 years of exemplars and prove definitively what the real thing used to look like anymore. What I have instead is a man who shows up, who carves the turkey, who keeps the schedule, who stands in a barn sometimes with his thumb resting on a burned piece of wood, and asks for absolutely nothing in return. Diane asked me last month what happens to the sealed file once the spreadsheet finally hits 100%. I told her the truth. I genuinely don't know yet. That isn't cruelty on my part. That's simply load testing. And besides, the file was never really the actual point of any of this. The point was that for a period of several months, my son believed the structure of me was condemned, easy pickings, demolition already scheduled on somebody's calendar, and he has now spent 2 full years discovering, payment by payment, Sunday by Sunday, exactly how much load the old framework was still quietly carrying the entire time. Some men need to try to rob you before they'll ever actually read the engineering report properly. I would have rather he simply asked me first. And now the part where I speak straight to you, because I can see the numbers on this channel. There are a great many of you out there watching tonight, and I have a fairly good idea why you're here. Some of you came for the justice itself, and I hope it landed cold enough for your particular taste. Mine ran somewhere around 31 degrees. But some of you, and you know exactly who you are right now, some of you are sitting in your own version of that truck in the driveway this very evening. Metaphorically or otherwise. You just found your own version of the sign on the lawn, whatever that sign looks like in your own life. The bank statement that quietly doesn't add up. The sibling who suddenly needs power of attorney for reasons they can't quite articulate. The child who only calls anymore when the subject is your house or your savings. The 38 seconds when what you actually needed was 38 minutes, and you're sitting there right now deciding whether to make noise about it or make one quiet phone call instead. Friend, listen to an old cabinet maker for just a moment. Don't make the noise. Noise feels satisfying for about 1 second, and it warns the entire job site all at once. Make the call instead. Not to the person who did it. They've already had every chance in the world. That's precisely how you know it's them. Call the lawyer. Call the county recorder's office. Call your state's elder abuse hotline. Every state has one if you look for 30 seconds. Find the Sal Ferreira 2 properties over that every single one of us has somewhere in our lives, if we think hard enough about who's actually been paying attention. Take your own 11 photographs, whatever they turn out to be in your situation. Find out exactly whose name is on your own deed and your own accounts this week, not someday. Say the word standing capacity provision to somebody with an actual law license before this month is out. You're not too old, you're not confused, and you are not powerless. You're sitting on decades of quiet receipts in a world run largely by people who have never once bothered to read past page 1, be page 4. And if all you can manage tonight is the 90 seconds in your own driveway where the entire world falls out from under you, take the 90 seconds. I had mine too, Sal would tell you, my pulse barely moved by the time he got me talking again. Then let the cabinet maker in you show up. He lives in you too, friends, whatever your actual trade happened to be. He's been on retainer your whole life, waiting for exactly this kind of call. Nora, wherever you're keeping your coffee these days, the house is full. Not the way either one of us ever drew it up on paper, but you always did tell me I over-engineered absolutely everything. And maybe grief and this particular kind of justice both needed that same stubborn redundancy built in from the start. The porch chair is still out, the recipe tin still sits exactly where it's always sat, and our granddaughter signs her letters like you now, so as far as I'm concerned, ma'am, you're still very much on site here. Save me a seat with a clear view of the water whenever the time comes for that. That's the story, friends. That's how my only son walked into my own bank and told a room full of strangers his father's mind was gone. 4 weeks after I nearly lost the use of my own arm, and how one boring, careful document signed by a grieving widower 2 years earlier turned his entire scheme into a signed confession with a strict payment plan attached. If this one held you all the way through to the end, do an old man 3 small favours before you go. Hit the like button. It genuinely tells the algorithm to put stories like this one in front of the next father sitting alone somewhere wondering if anybody else has lived through exactly what he's living through right now. Subscribe and ring the bell if you're new here to Dad's Cold Justice, because there's a brand new story on this channel every single day, and the freezer, I promise you, stays fully stocked. And third, and I genuinely mean this one, get down in the comments and tell me 2 things: where you're watching from tonight, and your own honest answer to the question my granddaughter asked me in that quiet room: can you still love somebody while they're paying you back? I read every single comment, usually right here on this porch with the coffee going cold, and some of your stories from last week are still sitting with me even now. You know exactly who you are, and you are the entire reason this channel exists at all. If today's story reminded you of somebody in your own life, send it along to them. You might turn out to be their Sal. Tomorrow's story: a widow in Ohio whose stepchildren tried to have her declared unfit using her own late husband's memory care records against her. And what a quiet woman, with a coupon binder and a filing cabinet, had been documenting patiently for nearly 9 years. You will not want to miss that one. Until then, this is Walt, from the porch, reminding you, keep your documents close, keep your receipts closer, and remember, the best revenge was never living well. The best revenge is living thoroughly documented. Take care of yourselves out there, and go check on your own dads this week.